Thank you, everyone, for coming. I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator tonight. Perhaps the greatest threat to our country and to our liberty are those who we of Americans have elected. I would like to welcome you to the Civil Liberties Tour. My name is David Parker, and I am president of Young Americans for Liberty here at Ohio State. Young Americans for Liberty is the largest and fastest growing pro-liberty youth organization in the country. Here at Ohio State, we are one of the largest and most active chapters. Our next meeting, for those interested in coming, is next Monday, February 13th in the Suzanne M. Schreier Room, which is on the 3rd floor of the Ohio Union. I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator today, Jack Hunter. Jack Hunter began his punditry career in the late 1990s when a friend and popular alternative rock disc jockey agreed to let Jack air his political views during the afternoon drive on 96 Wave in Charleston, South Carolina, as the Southern Avenger. Today we can find Jack's videos and columns as part of TAC TV at the American Conservative magazine. Jack is a frequent guest host of the Mike Church Show on Sirius XM's PATRIOT channel, and is frequent guest of the Savage Nation on nationally syndicated talk radio host Michael Savage. Jack also assisted Senator from Kentucky Rand Paul in his book The Tea Party Goes to Washington, released by Center Street in February of 2011. Without further ado, Jack Hunter.
Well, I appreciate the introduction. I appreciate all y'all being here tonight. It's really good to see you. It's been quite an adventure. This is night number 4 in our College Civil Liberties Tour, co-sponsored by Young Americans for Liberty and the Future Freedom Foundation. We've had a lot of fun. It's great to see so many people here tonight, and you're going to hear a lot of important issues addressed that need to be addressed that you don't necessarily hear in the mainstream conversations we hear on the news and whatnot. I'm going to introduce our speakers, our panelists for this evening before getting on with the program. Tonight on our panel we have Mr. Jacob Hornberger. Jacob Hornberger is founder and president of the Future Freedom Foundation. He received his BA degree in economics from the Virginia Military Institute and his law degree from the University of Texas. He was a civil and criminal trial attorney in Texas for 12 years and also served as an adjunct professor of law and economics at the University of Dallas. He is a regular libertarian commentator on Judge Andrew Napolitano's Freedom Watch on the Fox Business Network. Tonight we also have Mr. Glenn Greenwald. Glenn Greenwald is a former constitutional and civil rights litigator and is the author of 2 New York Times best-selling books on the Bush administration's executive power and foreign policy abuses. Greenwald was named by The Atlantic as one of the most 25 influential political commentators in the nation. He is the recipient of the first annual I.F. Stone Award for Independent Journalism and is the winner of the 2010 Online Journalism Association Award for his investigative work on the arrest and oppressive detention of Bradley Manning. And last but certainly not least this evening, you're going to be hearing from Mr. Bruce Fein. Bruce Fein graduated from Harvard Law School with honors in 1972. After a coveted federal judicial clerkship, he joined the U.S. Department of Justice, where he served as an assistant director of the Office of Legal Policy, a legal advisor to the Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust, and the Associate Deputy Attorney General under President Ronald Reagan. He has authored several volumes on the United States Supreme Court, the U.S. Constitution, and international law. Now, before we get to our panelists this evening, I wanted to share a few of my thoughts on the subject of where we're heading in this country, where we've been, and especially on the issue of civil liberties and freedoms, or I guess more importantly, encroached freedoms. We had a debate in December up on Capitol Hill over a little something called the National Defense Authorization Act, commonly referred to as the NDAA. Has anybody in this room heard about this? Apparently so. All right, we're in the right place this evening. Well, there was a big debate about what the National Defense Authorization Act really meant. There were some people in both parties that said, you know, it was fairly harmless, and there were some people, and especially some Republicans even, who said that there was a provision in this bill, Section 1031, that gave the government more importantly, or less importantly, more accurately, the executive branch the power to arrest American citizens without due process, without trial, with anything. President Obama decides you're a criminal or suspect, they pick you up, throw away the key. Congressman Justin Amash said of this particular legislation, quote, "It was one of the most anti-liberty pieces of legislation in our lifetime." The former governor of Virginia, Jim Gilmore, had this to say about the NDAA and this particular provision, quote, "The provisions of this bill undermine the basic safeguards that we enjoy as Americans. It is dangerous and should not be supported by anyone, Republican or Democrat, liberal or conservative, citizen or non-citizen." Gilmore added this very important part, quote, "This ill-considered bill is one of those dangers to our liberties by an unwise extension of military power in the homeland, contrary to all law, precedent, and history." And that's a little bit of what I want to talk about tonight. This is unprecedented in our history. The idea that the federal government can say, "Hey, we think you're a bad guy. We're not going to try you. We're not going to use due process. The Fourth Amendment and the other amendments are out the window. We're just going to lock you up, and that's the way it is." That's exactly what our founding fathers wanted to guard against by even creating the Constitution. Now, there were other people debating this on Capitol Hill, that did not agree with Justin Amash or what former Governor Gilmore had to say about the provisions in the NDAA bill. One of them was Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, who I'm a big fan of. I don't know if you guys are a big fan of Senator Lindsey Graham. Tongue planted in firmly in cheek there. He had this to say when people were wondering, well, does this allow the government to arrest private citizens without due process? He said, "We're in a time of war, and those laws don't apply, and this bill, according to Graham," and this is a quote, "designates the world as the battlefield, including the homeland." Now, I don't know about you, but I've heard from guys like Senator Lindsey Graham for at least the last decade that in the war on terrorism, we have to fight them over there so we don't have to fight them over here. Well, it seems like Senator Graham's changed his tune by saying now that the world is a battlefield, including the homeland. In a state of perpetual war, where people like Senator Lindsey Graham and those on Capitol Hill and in Washington, D.C. who think like him, think that you can have these extra and anti-constitutional measures, that you can circumvent the Constitution because we're in a war. That's scary enough. Think about that war lasting forever, as Senator Graham and his compatriots certainly want to happen. That means those protections go away forever, and they go away on our own homeland. Senator Lindsey Graham also had this bit of wisdom to add during the NDAA debate. He said of terrorist suspects, quote, "When they say I want to talk to a lawyer, we tell them, shut up. You don't get a lawyer." That's where we're at, folks. You know, a lot of people talk in this country about moral decline. We hear that especially from a lot of my fellow conservatives. It's usually related to social issues or the health of the family or the sanctity of life or the state of marriage in this country. And those are all things we can talk about, debate, and discuss. What I don't hear enough from people from across the political spectrum, and especially those who emphasize morality and the decline of morality in the United States, is the decline of our constitutional ideas and philosophy and protections that really define who we are as Americans. I mean, the reason that we have a Constitution, the Founding Fathers, is we're supposed to have special protections unique to us in this country. And to say we're just going to get rid of them because we're in a state of perpetual war? Well, what does that make us? That's a decline in morality that we should all be worried about. I don't care where you fall on the political spectrum. And you don't hear people talking about it enough. Senator Rand Paul, during the debate on the NDAA, had this to say, "Should we err today and remove some of the most important checks on state power in the name of fighting terrorism, well then the terrorists have won." He is absolutely right. We've gone from you got to fight them over there so you don't have to fight them here to saying, hey, we're going to fight them here too, and all Americans are going to lose out on their constitutional protections. that's losing. That means the terrorists have won. If they can induce fear to the extent, whether through 9/11 or anything they might do in the future or think about doing, that we would give up what makes us Americans, Senator Rand Paul is absolutely right. They have won. Now, President Obama said that, yes, we have this power to arrest people, indefinite detention, but we're not going to abuse it. That was his attitude about it. Well, to support giving government this sort of power, and I don't care where you fall on the political spectrum, you have to believe one of two things. That government never makes mistakes, and government never abuses its power. Now, I know few people who believe either. And yet, from right to left, conservative to liberal, you have people who are arguing against this stuff, and you have people who are completely in favor of this stuff. It crosses, it's sort of a bipartisan thing. You'll hear a little bit more later about the fact that, when George W. Bush had the PATRIOT Act and was circumventing these constitutional protections and whatnot, the bane of the liberals' existence is what Bush, Cheney, what they stood for, as far as what they were doing about hurting constitutional protections in the name of the war on terror. Well, now we have a Democratic president who is not only maintaining all of those policies, but increasing them. And guys like Senator Lindsey Graham and John McCain and Joe Lieberman will stand up and say this is great, and people like Hillary Clinton and Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid will stand up and say this is great. Sort of a bipartisan consensus that we should give up our liberties forever. I think that's a bad idea. Benjamin Franklin said that when you give up your liberty for security, you get neither. He was absolutely right. James Madison had this to say: of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. In war, too, the discretionary power of the executive is extended, and that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing a president of the United States, an executive branch that behaves more like a tyrant than anything we've seen, certainly in recent history, but most of this country's history. There is a decline in morality in this country, and forget about the social issues or all the stuff everybody else likes to talk about, not that it's not important. But the number one thing that unites us as Americans and makes us Americans is on the way out. And it's the name of protecting us. And it's not protecting us. It's hurting this country. I dare say it's destroying this country. Well, we're going to bring up our first guest next, Mr. Jacob Hornberger of the Future of Freedom Foundation.
When the Constitution was presented to the American people, most Americans weren't exactly excited about the idea. And the reason was because Americans of that time, our ancestors, they didn't have a good feeling about government. In fact, they considered their own government the biggest threat to their freedom. Not the British government, not the terrorists, not anybody else. They thought that the biggest threat to their freedom and their well-being was their own government. They were concerned that this Constitution was going to be calling into existence a government that could do whatever it wanted to do. It would have whatever powers it needed to keep people safe or to take care of people, to do the right thing. They weren't interested in that. They had lived under that kind of government. The proponents of the Constitution said, look, you don't need to worry about this. Because for the first time in history, we the people are calling into existence the government. We called the federal government into existence. We're the sovereigns. It is the servant. Oh, and by the way, its powers are going to be enumerated in this charter, in this document. If the power doesn't exist there, it can't exercise it. So there's no power to take away people's freedom of speech and freedom of religion and other fundamental rights, right to bear arms. You don't need to worry about it. And our American ancestors said, okay, we'll go with the deal on that premise. But to make sure of this, to make it real clear that we don't trust this government, we demand the enactment of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And there really shouldn't be called a Bill of Rights at all, because it's not a Bill of Rights. It's really a bill of prohibitions. It prohibits the government from taking away people's fundamental rights, pre-existing rights, God-given rights. Freedom of religion, freedom of the press, right to keep and bear arms. But notice something different. 4 amendments don't really deal with fundamental rights. They stick out. They're different. Those are the 4th Amendment, the 5th Amendment, the 6th Amendment, and the 8th Amendment. And what those amendments are a reflection of how our American ancestors viewed the threat that government posed to them in terms of having the power to come and seize them, cart them away to a torture center, torture the heck out of them, and even execute them without any kind of due process, trial by jury, any obstructions at all. That's what they were concerned with, that their own government would do that. Not just take away freedom of speech, take away their body over to a torture center. And so you have things like the right to a lawyer to defend you when the government's coming after you. You have a right to be notified of the charges against you with a grand jury indictment. You have a right to a trial by jury. Right to due process of law. These rights stretch all the way back in English history. And they arose in resistance to the tyranny of people's own government. If you go back to the year 1215, the English people there were living under a regime where the government had the power, the king had the power to just seize people, have his soldiers cart away a person to the Tower of London, torture him, kill him. And that was just the way it was. And then all of a sudden, the barons of England held King John, their own king, their own government, at the point of a sword and said, no more. You're not going to do this anymore. You're not going to do it less. You're going to not do it at all because you're not going to have the power to do it. And that's what Magna Carta was all about. They extracted from King John a concession. It was unbelievable. A concession that he lacked the power to take any person into custody arbitrarily and take him away to be tortured or killed. In violation of what was called the law of the land in Magna Carta. And that phrase, in Magna Carta, law of the land, gradually worked up through the centuries and became known as due process of law. It's a phrase that we all grow up with. It's almost part of our psyche, our fiber as Americans. And at very minimum, it came to be encompassing notice and hearing. If they want to come and get you, if the king wants to get you, if the president wants to get you, give you notice of the charges and give you an opportunity to defend against those charges. Jump forward to 9/11, and those 4 amendments went out the window. No constitutional amendment. I mean, that's what we've always been taught. If you want to amend the Constitution, you go through the process. Those 4 amendments were wiped out. That's the monumental legal revolution under which we now live. We now live in a country in which the president can send his military, his army, his CIA, his FBI, and seize anyone in this room. Cart him away to a concentration camp. No jury trial. No due process of law. Torture him. Waterboard him as many times as they want. Execute him. That's the kind of country we now live in. It's a country in which the president has the authority, through his subordinates, to break into people's homes secretly, rummage through your private affairs, monitor your email, your telephone calls. Even when a warrant is technically required, they're not worried. Nothing's going to happen to them if they break the law. We saw that in the telecom scandal, where they got people to deliberately break the law, and Congress gave them immunity. All under this guise of this nebulous, meaningless, ridiculous term called national security, for which there is no definition. We live in a country in which the president, on his own authority, can send the entire nation into war without any declaration of war by Congress, regardless of what the Constitution says. Indeed, we live in a country in which the President of the United States can assassinate any one of you And he doesn't have to explain why. He doesn't have to explain the standards. He can deprive you of your life in violation of the law of the land or due process of law. That's a remarkable thing. It's a remarkable, shameful thing that we who are living today permitted that to happen. After what, 700, 800 years of resistance to this, we live in an era in which it's all been cast aside. All under this guise of this war on terrorism. And you know how they did it? They took a criminal offense, which terrorism is. Everybody acknowledges that terrorism is a federal criminal offense. If you don't believe it, go talk to any federal judge, any federal prosecutor. There's terrorism prosecutions in federal courts all across the land. It is a federal criminal offense. But in the climate of fear of 9/11, the Bush administration says, he decreed, no constitutional amendment, we decree that we now have the authority to define, to label a terrorist act as either a criminal act or an act of war. Oh, and by the way, it's an illegal act of war because the enemy's not wearing uniforms, so we're not even bound by the laws of war, Geneva Convention and so forth. We're not bound by anything. We're back to pre-Magna Carta. In fact, the whole idea of Guantanamo Bay, that prison camp there, it was to be a constitution-free zone. I mean, this is the ultimate irony. All these people take oaths to support and defend the Constitution, and then they go set up a camp, a prison camp, that is specifically designed to be a no-Constitution area. It was absolutely amazing. So they could do whatever they wanted to there, and that was their design. And let me tell you something, that's not an accident. They love that kind of system. They don't like the kind of system under which we live that our ancestors bequeathed to us. They don't like those 4th, 5th, and 6th, and 8th Amendments. I mean, you can see that in terms of the dictatorial regimes that they support. I mean, look at Egypt. You know what those people in Egypt are protesting against? It wasn't just Mubarak, their dictator. You know what they were protesting against and what they're still protesting against? They're protesting these powers that our government now wields. The power to seize people and cart them away and torture them and stuff. They want that military dictatorship in Egypt to relinquish those powers. They want it to do what King John did, to concede that the powers no longer exist. And the military dictatorship says, no. We come first, the military says. You build your society on top of us. The U.S. officials totally agree with that. Who do you think's been funding the Egyptian military dictatorship? For 30 years. And why did they choose the military dictatorship to rendition a guy to for the purpose of torture? Because they're good torturers. Because they are a good military dictatorship. They're a brutal dictatorship. And that's why the U.S. government partnered with them in their rendition program. In fact, several CIA officials that did the kidnapping of a guy in Italy and renditioned him to Egypt, they're now felons. Because they got convicted in Italy for the felony crime of kidnapping a guy that they sent to Egypt, which is the brutal military dictatorship. And again, they chose that because they believe in it. You know, they have all this born-again fervor against Syria. Oh, that Assad's got to leave and all this. You know, they got the UN resolutions. Who do you think they renditioned Mehar Arar to? He's a Canadian citizen that was at Dulles Airport in Virginia changing planes on the way home to Canada, and the CIA kidnaps him and believes he's a terrorist, doesn't take him to federal court, doesn't take him to a federal magistrate to set bond, to get charges, to get a grand jury impaneled to charge him. They sent him, guess where? To Syria. Who negotiated that deal? You know, they say, we don't talk to dictatorships. Oh, no? Well, then who negotiated that deal? Did the president sign off on it? Libya? Remember the big deal? Bombing Libya to free because we love the Libyan people and so forth? Give me a break. The CIA was chagrined because when they broke into the secret headquarters of Gaddafi, the rebels found all the documents showing that the CIA had used Gaddafi's secret torture forces to torture people there. I mean, you know what their model is? I mean, you can look in history. It goes back, to Mossadegh in 1953 when they oust the democratically elected prime minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, man who was Time Magazine's Man of the Year. The CIA ousts him in a coup. They destroyed Iran's democracy, and now they complain that Iran's all messed up with a dictatorship. They have themselves to blame. And they install a dictator called the Shah of Iran, unelected, who brutalizes the Iranian people for some 25 years. The CIA works with his secret intelligence force to torture the Iranian people. No wonder they revolted. But you see, we're not supposed to talk about that. We're not supposed to talk about the things that the government does to precipitate the anger and hatred that people have all over the world for this country. And primarily because of what the government has done. You see, they say history starts with 9/11. History starts with 9/11. Bull. It starts with what was happening before 9/11. It starts with what was happening before 9/11. You had sanctions against Iraq that was killing tens of thousands of people, of children, every year. It was incredible. 2 high UN officials, Hans von Sponeck and Dennis Holliday, they resigned from the UN in protest to what they called genocide. These children dying year after year to the total indifference of U.S. officials. They wouldn't lift the sanctions. To this day, they still go after Americans who were trying to get medicines in to help the Iraqi people. Madeleine Albright, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, she's the official spokesman for the U.S. government to the world. She goes on 60 Minutes in 1996, 5 years before the sanctions were finally lifted. And they ask her, 500,000 Iraqi children have died from these sanctions. Do you think it's worth it? And she thinks for a moment. She says, well, it's tough, but yeah, it's worth it. And by worth it, she meant regime change, trying to get rid of Saddam. Imagine that. The willingness to sacrifice innocent children. How can that not get people angry? Not just the parents of the children, not just the brothers and sisters and the relatives and aunts and uncles, but just people generally that get outraged over something like this. The moral outrage. They stationing troops near Mecca and Medina. I mean, we at the Future of Freedom Foundation said, if you don't stop this, we said this all during the 90s, if you don't stop this, you're going to have terrorist retaliation on American soil. And we weren't the only ones. There's a great scholar whose books I highly recommend. His name is Chalmers Johnson. He wrote a book called Blowback. You can Google his articles. Yeah, I mean, he's just fantastic. And Johnson said this. He was a former consultant to the CIA, and he says, if you don't stop this, you're going to see terrorist attacks on American soil. And it didn't take a rocket scientist to do this. You had the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center, which was no different in principle from the ones 8 years later. Oh, and by the way, they later found one of the guys, Ramzi Youssef, in Pakistan, and they didn't bomb Pakistan. They didn't invade Pakistan. They didn't treat it as a military problem. They waited the guy out. They finally found him. They caught him. They arrested him. They brought him back. They prosecuted him in federal court for terrorism. At his sentencing hearing, in an angry fit of rage, he says, I did this because of what your government has done to people here in the Middle East, including the killing of children, innocent children in Iraq. And they sent him to the penitentiary where he is now. No wedding parties bombed. No innocent people killed. Compare that to after 9/11. They go into Iraq to finish what the sanctions had not accomplished. That was the only reason. The WMDs was a fake and false rationale to cover up what the sanctions had not done. Get rid of Saddam and put their favorite dictatorship in. And that's what's in there now. Is a democratically elected dictatorship. Brutal to the max. Still torturing people. Doing everything Saddam did. And they say, oh, you're just blaming America. You're just blaming America. You know why they do that? Because in their minds, the federal government is America. And when you present to them the oddity that, hey, well, what do you do with the Bill of Rights then? They don't know what to do. Because you see, the Bill of Rights expressly protects America from the federal government. So how can they be one and the same when it's clear that there's two separate entities here? And that's what we're about. You know, we got to straighten things out. And the question is it, you know, how important is this to you? You got here on this panel, you got a liberal, a conservative, and a libertarian going on tour and fighting these principles because we understand that this is not what freedom's about. This is not a free society. And let me tell you something, you got a vested interest in this. Because you may have a little professional army over here that's going to be going and fighting all these little foreign wars and so forth, but you never know when things might get out of control. These people, or people of their ilk, sent 60,000 of my generation to their deaths in a meaningless, idiotic, stupid war in Southeast Asia. I mean, I still remember when I was at VMI, listening to in the mess hall when they would, you know, say attention to orders and announce some upperclassman killed in action who had been there, you know, just a couple years before. 60,000 American men dead for nothing. All those maimed people, nothing. And don't think it can't happen to you. Because if things get out of control, as I understand it, every one of you guys still registers for the draft. Like you're a little serf, like a little slave, ready to be called up to sacrifice your life for this imperial regime. And that's what it is. It's an empire. It's not a republic. They got bases all over the world. They got regime changes all over the world, occupations, invasions, sanctions, embargoes. And if they lose control out of something and you end up in some great big land war in Asia, remember that we were here trying to warn you to join up with us, stop this thing, dismantle it. Not only because you have a vested interest in it, but also because freedom matters. You know, what does it mean to be free? And that's what you got to ask yourself. Is this a free society? Because I suggest to you they've lied to you just like they lied to me when I was a kid. When they tell you you live in a free society, nonsense. You don't live in a free society. You're not a free person. You're just a little serf where the sovereign is the government and you're the servant. And so what can we do about it? Well, that's something you got to decide for yourself, you know, how important it is to you. And then if it's important to you to restore a free society, join up with those of us who are trying to restore a free society. Then you decide for yourself, where do you fit in? What are you best at? And can we do that? Oh, well, they'll tell you all this is permanent. We all grew up in this warfare imperial state. And we all have been told that this is freedom and you need this giant military industrial complex, national security state to be safe and free, and nonsense. You know, as Jack said, you trade your liberty for security, you're going to get neither. And as far as I'm concerned, you know, the only way to get rid of this junk is to dismantle it all. Bring all those troops home from everywhere. Bring them home, because they're only causing a lot of damage. But if you're not going to do that, don't take away my freedom. I'll take my chances with the terrorists. Don't take away my freedom. They may bomb my building where I work or whatever, fine. I'll take the chances. At least I die a free person. But don't try to make me safe. Don't try to keep me safe with your little pat-downs at the airports and your power to assassinate me and the power to take me into custody. Get rid of all that junk. I'll take my chances, because freedom is what matters to me. How can we do this? We just do it with the power of ideas like we're doing here. Sharing ideas on liberty with other people until such a point where you reach a critical mass in society of people yearning to breathe free. And that's exactly what will happen. Thank you very much.
Good evening, and thanks very much for coming out tonight. I've been really interested for many years now and have written many times about this idea that defense of civil liberties is an issue that really transcends partisan loyalty and even ideological orientation, and that a coalition of citizens from across the ideological spectrum banding together to defend core liberties and to challenge this imperial aggression makes a lot of sense in a lot of different ways. And I'm really excited to be part of a speaking tour that's designed to bring that principle to life by putting together people across the ideological spectrum to talk about our common interest in defending these principles. So I'm really grateful to the Young Americans for Liberty and the Future of Freedom Foundation for putting together this tour that arose out of this idea. I have spent the last several years going around to lots of different places, lots of college campuses and other places, talking about civil liberties. And civil liberties is a very complex topic, and there's lots of different approaches one can take to discussing it. And when I would go for the first couple of years during the Obama administration in 2009 and 2010 to speak to audiences, largely progressive or liberal audiences, about the state of civil liberties, I would devote myself to the argument that President Obama was continuing the bulk, the core essence, the defining features of the Bush-Cheney approach to terrorism, foreign policy, and civil liberties. That, in other words, he was embracing what a few years ago used to be known in progressive circles as the shredding of the Constitution and right-wing radicalism, and is now called President Obama's tough stance on terrorism, that President Obama was continuing the essence of those policies, the ones that only a few short years ago were extremely controversial. And when I would make that argument, I would devote the bulk of my time, in fact, almost all of my time, to systematically examining one by one all of the policies that President Obama was continuing that progressives only a few short years ago were denouncing as extremism and an attack on all that we hold sacred. And the reason I would do that is because it would be necessary to persuade people that the argument I was making was true, because even liberals and progressives sympathetic to criticisms of the president were just intuitively resistant to the idea that this was true. After all, George Bush was this swaggering, religious fanatic, unilateralist, warmongering cowboy in the progressive mind, and Dick Cheney was, you know, basically Darth Vader or like the spawn of Satan or something. So how could it possibly be true that this wonderfully urbane, sophisticated Harvard Law School graduate, constitutional law scholar, progressive could possibly be continuing the bulk of the Bush-Cheney assault on the Constitution and civil liberties? That was just inconceivable to most people. And so I would have to go one by one talking about those policies. Well, just 3 short years after Obama's inauguration, now going into the 4th year of the Obama presidency, I no longer need to do that. And that's because this continuity is so glaringly obvious, so self-evident, that very few people need to be convinced any longer that it's true. It's obviously true. And so rather than spend my time proving that and going one by one and examining all these policies, I want to instead look at 2 other aspects of the state of civil liberties and an imperial foreign policy in the United States that I think are a little bit less obvious, but probably more important and more interesting. The first of which is to ask, what is the effect, what are the consequences of this continuity, of the fact that the Democratic Party has now embraced with equal vigor what until very recently was considered the provenance of right-wing radicalism in these areas? What is the primary consequence of that? And secondly, I want to ask and examine the question, why should we care? What are the reasons that we ought to be concerned with these civil liberties? I mean, it's true, as Jacob said, that these are inherent parts of our heritage, that the founders believed their preservation was important, that we think about it in terms of what makes us American, but I'm not really sure that's sufficient to convince other people, and maybe even ourselves, that these belong at the top of our list of priorities. I think we need to understand why they affect our interest in more material and direct ways in order to really make that case persuasively. So I think it's worth asking, why should we care about these issues? So to look at the first issue, which is what are the consequences of the continuity, I want to begin by sharing with you a personal anecdote that I experienced a few years ago that is kind of embarrassing, I have to say. but I'm going to share it with you anyway because that's just the sort of self-sacrificing person that I am. What basically happened is I talked about what I would talk about when I went around in 2009 and 2010 talking about civil liberties. In 2007 and 2008, when I would go around talking about civil liberties, what I would typically do is talk about the ways that George Bush and Dick Cheney were assaulting the Constitution and were ushering in this radicalism, this extremism that was undermining the guarantees that we were supposed to enjoy as Americans. And typically what would happen is when I would give that argument, offer that perspective, somebody in the audience would stand up, and I actually remember this particularly vividly at a speech I gave to Jacob's organization. In early 2008, someone stood up and he identified himself as a libertarian, and he said, look, I agree with you completely that George Bush and Dick Cheney have been egregious in rolling back these guarantees and in ushering in what we consider to be sort of tyrannical powers. But you seem to think that if Democrats get into office that things are going to improve. And I believe, he said, that if a Democrat gets into office that he will become or she will become enamored of these powers. At the time it was either Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton who he was talking about. And he said, I think they're going to become just as enamored of these powers, convinced that they can exercise them responsibly and won't give any of them up. And what's more, he said, and I heard this a lot, I think that Democrats or people who are identified as liberals or progressives like you, Glenn Greenwald, are going to go along with it and be supportive of it now that there's a president in office that you like and trust rather than one that you dislike and distrust. And what I would say in response to that concern every time that I heard it, including then, was I would say I was actually pretty dismissive of it. And what I would say is, you know, look, I can't predict the future, and there's probably going to be a few Democrats who are really at that level of hackery and intellectual dishonesty who will probably change course and cheer for the very policies that they've spent the last 8 years vehemently denouncing. But you know, even if progressives and liberals and Democrats are tempted out of partisan self-interest to support these policies just because a Democratic president is continuing them, I still don't think that they'll do it just out of sheer embarrassment. I mean, the idea was, in my mind, that they were so invested in this framework of grievances against Bush and Cheney and the Republican right. They had been so vocal in their denunciations of these policies in the name of terrorism that there was no way to maintain even a shred of dignity or integrity if you were willing to stand up and acquiesce to these very same policies that you spent the last decade depicting as the heart of fascism. And therefore, I didn't think that a Democratic president could induce the Democratic Party and its loyalists to support them. And every now and then I have this fantasy, I've actually been entertaining it quite a lot this week as we go around on this tour, of finding out the names of the individuals who asked me that question and finding out where they live and flying around the country one by one to each of their homes and apologizing for the answer I gave. Because it's true, I don't think I've ever been wrong about anything in the entire time I've been writing about politics, maybe in my entire life, as I was about that. Because what we've seen is, one by one, those policies that both Jack and Jacob talked about, that progressives really did depict as the root of all evil, now being not just a failure to reverse them, but affirmatively and enthusiastically embraced by President Obama. The use of military commissions to convict people, even worse, indefinite detention where people are imprisoned for life without charges of any kind. The invocation of the state secrets privilege, where the president says, if you sue me and claim that I've broken the law, I'm going to tell courts that what I did was too secret, and therefore courts can't even evaluate whether what I did was illegal. In other words, removing myself from the rule of law. And even policies where President Obama has accelerated the abuses, such as the unprecedented war on whistleblowers that his administration is conducting. When people expose government secrets, they try them under espionage statutes. They've done those prosecutions more in this administration than all previous administrations combined. Or his asserted power to wage war, not just in the absence of congressional authority, but even once Congress votes against it, as happened with the war on Libya when the House rejected an authorization and the war continued anyway. And of course, the most egregious being the asserted power to target American citizens for execution by the CIA determinations made by the president unilaterally with total secrecy and with no checks or due process of any kind, a power that he's not only asserted in theory but exercised in fact when the American-born U.S. citizen, a U.S. citizen every bit as much as anybody in this room, Anwar al-Awlaki was targeted by the president for execution and then assassinated by drone attack in Yemen by the CIA. And what you see is progressives and liberals and Democrats, with some exceptions. The ACLU has been vehement in protesting all of these policies from the start, as have others. But by and large, the Democratic Party and the progressive movement being, if not overtly supportive, then certainly tolerating and being acquiescent to these policies. And I just want to offer one illustrative point about just how egregious this hypocrisy, this dishonesty is. If you look at what the big scandals, the civil liberties scandals were of the Bush administration from a liberal perspective, there really are two issues that stand out. One is the scandal that arose when the New York Times revealed that the Bush administration was spying on the conversations of American citizens without going to court and getting a warrant. That was something that liberals were horrified by. How can a president spy on the communications of American citizens without first going to a court and getting a warrant? And I joined in that outrage and horror. I thought that was a horrible thing, and all Democrats were with me on that. And the second scandal was the idea that the president could detain American citizens, or anybody, in fact, as happened at Guantanamo, detain them indefinitely without charges or due process. That happened to Jose Padilla, an American citizen arrested on U.S. soil in Chicago at Chicago O'Hare International Airport in 2002, and was detained for 3.5 years without charges of any kind, without any contact with the outside world, including a lawyer. How could a president in a free and democratic country possibly detain American citizens without due process of any kind? This is the heart of tyranny, said the Democratic Party. And now with a Democrat in office, the president is not only eavesdropping on our conversations without due process, he is, and not only detaining people without due process, he's doing that as well. He's targeting them for assassination. He's killing American citizens without due process, and yet the very same political movement that was horrified by mere eavesdropping on or detaining of people without due process is silent, if not supportive, of the killing of American citizens without due process. And this, to me, is an extraordinarily significant development, because what has happened as a result of this development, of this acquiescence, this intellectual dishonesty, is that these policies that until a few years ago were really the symbol of neoconservatism or Republican extremism. These were policies that triggered very divisive debates in the United States. If I spoke about these policies 3 years ago to a room full of Republicans and Democrats, 50% of the people in the room would hate me and would say that the policies I was attacking were crucial. Those were called Republicans. And 50% of the room would be screaming and cheering and applauding because these policies were horrible. Those were called Democrats. And yet now if I give the same speech to the same group of people, roughly 90 or 95% of the people in the room will hate me because they will say the policies that I'm attacking are important ones for defending us from terrorism, Republicans and Democrats alike, and maybe 5 or 10% will stay consistent and continue to believe that these policies are dangerous. What President Obama has done is converted these policies from very divisive symbols of republicanism into bipartisan consensus. They are no longer the provenance of one party or one political faction. They are now the unchallenged policies of the American political class. And the reason why that's so significant is because when policies are transformed, are enshrined as bipartisan consensus, they are removed from mainstream political debate. They become entrenched and invulnerable to challenge. There's some extremely interesting scholarship by a Yale law professor, Jack Balkin, who has looked at what happens when the two parties embrace policies. He looked at the way that when FDR ushered in the New Deal, Republicans were beside themselves and vowed to uproot it, and yet the first Republican president they elected, Dwight Eisenhower, tinkered with the New Deal but didn't uproot it, and therefore it became the permanent way that the American government functions, protected and shielded for generations. The same thing happened with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society reforms. When Richard Nixon, the first Republican president, was elected after Lyndon Johnson, he ignored the Goldwater Republicans of the 1960s who wanted to change the Great Society, and instead he even expanded many parts of it, and then it became part of our political landscape. That is what has happened with these extraordinarily radical and dangerous civil liberties assaults and foreign policy premises. They have become shielded and entrenched for a generation because they are now the policy of both political parties and therefore not debated in mainstream circles any longer. And it's an amazingly consequential development. And I think the important implication for those of us who care about these policies and these issues and these values and thinking about how to change them is that the first premise has to be that no change of any significance, no meaningful challenge to imperialism and aggressive foreign policy, domination by the military-industrial complex, the complete disregarding of constitutional liberties, none of that will happen by devoting yourself to the establishment leadership of either of the two political parties, because they are both equally committed to its preservation. And that's why, for me, when I look to things that make me optimistic, things that are interesting to me or that generate my support, what I look for is any kind of substantial political energy that takes place outside of those structures. And it's one of the reasons why I found, for example, the Tea Party in the very early stages to be exciting, even though I disagreed with a lot of the people's premises who were there, because it was really intended to be a challenge to the Republican Party before it got co-opted as an organ of it. And it's why I found Occupy Wall Street to be extremely exciting as well, because that was not in any way intended to be an aid to or a supplement to the Democratic Party. They were at least as angry at President Obama as they were at large banks and crony capitalism and the military-industrial complex. And it's why on December 31st, I triggered on purpose an extremely acrimonious debate among progressives and liberals and Democrats when I wrote an article arguing that progressives should be applauding the Ron Paul candidacy and the excitement it's produced, even if progressives disagree with Ron Paul's positions on a variety of issues, as they naturally will because he's not a progressive. Nonetheless, what he's doing is something extremely significant, and not just him, but the entire movement that has fueled his prominence, which is he is taking arguments that are otherwise never heard, but that are incredibly important, and he is forcing them into mainstream discourse in a way that very few other movements of the last several decades have been able to do. And the thing that really prompted me to write that was an amazing advertisement that I saw, and you can go to it on YouTube if you haven't already seen it, but it was a commercial produced by an affiliate of the Ron Paul campaign, and its title was Imagine. And what it did was it asked American citizens to imagine that what we are doing to the rest of the world instead would be done to us. So it said, imagine if there are foreign troops that invaded our land and occupied our states for 10 years and set up prisons where they abducted our citizens and took them to a prison in the Caribbean island or far away to an ocean and kept them there without charges of any kind, and that regularly bombed wedding parties and villages and farms and cities and slaughtered our children and innocent men and women. And imagine that the same country, these foreign invaders, had bases and armies all over the world. Think about the anger and hostility and resolve to fight back and attack that nation that was doing that to us. That's exactly what we are triggering in the rest of the world. We claim that our policies are designed to stop terrorism, and yet those policies are doing more to fuel anti-American hatred and terrorism than anything that we could possibly devise. And the fact that that argument was being made, not by the three of us who have been making it for quite a while or other people, but by someone who was leading the Republican Party, or at the top of the list of Republican presidential candidates and bringing that message to evangelical communities in Iowa and military communities in South Carolina and the viewership of Fox News, and was doing so forcefully and unapologetically and winning huge numbers of votes anyway in the Republican election, signifies to me the template for how these orthodoxies can be challenged. They can only work by challenging the two parties' establishment. And that's really what the Ron Paul candidacy is about. I tried explaining to lots of progressives, even though he's a Republican and therefore in the progressive mind, the root of all evil, we all know that. The candidacy really is about subverting and undermining the conventions and orthodoxies of the Republican Party from within, and therefore should be welcomed by anybody who's dissatisfied with the two political parties. So that's what I think is the effect of this bipartisan consensus and how it needs to be undermined. And I just want to spend a little bit of time asking about why we should care about these assaults on civil liberties. And the reason why I think it's worth asking that question is because the answer really isn't obvious. It's easy to be kind of glib about these issues and just say, well, freedom is important, and these civil liberties are what distinguish us as Americans, and all of that is true, and I believe that wholeheartedly. And I think Jacob is incredibly persuasive on that point, and I think Bruce, when you hear from him next, will be as well. But I think that more is needed to, as a persuasion matter, even to ourselves, to understand why these issues are so important. And the reason that I think that is because I would be willing to bet that virtually the vast majority of people in this room, if not all of us, wake up with a list of worries every day that does not include, certainly not at the top of the list, that government agents are going to come knocking on our door this afternoon and cart us off to Guantanamo. Or that a drone is going to fly over our home and shoot a Hellfire missile that is going to kill our families or our children or our loved ones. And so I think it's important to ask why we should care about that if we're not acutely threatened by these developments, if it doesn't seem like it's in our immediate self-interest to care. And to answer that question, I just want to tell another brief anecdote. This one, though, is not, I don't think, embarrassing. Although I'll leave that to you, maybe it is, but I don't think so. But the story I want to tell is that before I started doing what I do now, which is writing about politics and writing about these issues, I used to litigate constitutional cases, constitutional law cases. And I represented people whose constitutional liberties were being infringed by the government or by various other private parties, and I would focus a lot on free speech cases. And in the course of representing people whose free speech rights were being violated, I often represented people who espoused very heinous viewpoints, repellent, repulsive views. So I represented lots of neo-Nazis, I represented avowed white supremacists, I represented very extremist anti-immigrant activists who even believed in violence as a way of dealing with people who were here illegally. And I would often get asked the question, and this is true of lots of people who represent people like that in the constitutional case. When the ACLU represented Nazis who wanted to march through Skokie, Illinois, a community of Holocaust survivors, they were always asked that, especially by their donors who stopped donating when they represented them, which is, look, I agree with you and your commitment to free speech. I think it's wonderful, very commendable. But why is it that you have to represent people who have views that are this horrible? Why can't you represent people with views that are more palatable and a little bit nicer, not these horrible people over here? You hear that question all the time, even from people who think they're sympathetic to what it is that you're doing. And the answer to that always seemed obvious to me, but it really isn't. And the answer is that people who espouse nice, comfortable viewpoints that are welcomed by decent society and who are supported by the majority aren't the people who have their free speech rights targeted by the state. The people who have their free speech rights targeted by the state or who have their civil liberties targeted by the state are always people who are marginalized, who are people who are on the fringes of society. And the reason that happens is because the government knows that if they want to institutionalize abuses of power, the way to do that is to target people who the majority views with disdain. with the knowledge that if they target people who are on the fringes, who are viewed with disdain, that most people won't feel threatened by these powers. Well, they're only doing this to these very strange Muslim preachers who are in Yemen and are probably up to no good anyway, and so I'm not really that concerned because it's probably not going to affect me. And the flaw, the fallacy in that reasoning is that once you acquiesce in the first instance to an abuse of power, it becomes institutionalized, it becomes legitimized, so that when it starts expanding in its application, as it always does, by then it's too late to fight it, once it starts getting applied in ways that you dislike. And so I just want to briefly look at the reasons why we should care about these civil liberties abuses, even though we don't seem like they're being directly affected. One obvious answer that I used to think would help persuade people, and I've subsequently seen that it doesn't, is to make the following argument, which is if you vest the president with a certain power, and you're comfortable doing that because the president at the moment is somebody whom you like and trust, and believe will exercise the power for the good, even though they're doing it in secret and without any checks, at some point that person is going to leave office and there's going to be another president in office who you don't like or trust very much, and it's going to be that president who also exercises those same powers. So during the Bush years, I used to try and tell conservatives, look, I know you think George Bush is a wonderful person, he's a great family man, he's an evangelical Christian, he would never do anything bad with his power. We all know that. But just imagine if Hillary Clinton is president, as they all were certain that she was. Do you really want her being able to listen in on your conversations and read your emails without having to go to a court and get a warrant? And I always try now to say to progressives, look, Barack Obama, I mean, he's a Nobel Peace Prize winner. Of course, he would never abuse his power. I mean, just yesterday, a NATO airstrike killed 8 Afghan children in Afghanistan for probably the 50th time in the last year, but it was very accidental. He has a very good heart. He would never abuse his powers. That's a given. We all know that. But imagine if, say, Sarah Palin or Newt Gingrich or whoever the scary progressive villain of the moment is, Michelle Bachmann. Imagine if Michelle Bachmann becomes president. Do you feel comfortable having her have the power to target American citizens in complete secrecy and with no checks for assassination by the CIA? And the reason why that seems like that should be an intuitive argument. It doesn't take all that much brain power to understand why it should be compelling, but it isn't, because people are so focused on short-term political gain, on winning elections for their party, that they don't think that far ahead, that kind of future speculative harm isn't enough to make them criticize their own party. And so I think it takes a little bit more to convince people that they should care. And so I want to look at just a couple reasons why I think it's important to care and why you can convince people that they should. As I said, I mean, once these powers are institutionalized in a certain way, they always expand beyond their original application in ways you can't anticipate. So powers that the government seized in the name of the drug war have now been applied and extended to almost every single type of criminal prosecution. Or the PATRIOT Act, which was enacted in the immediate aftermath in a very rushed and pressured way after 9/11, has now been applied to a whole range of issues having nothing to do with terrorism. All sorts of domestic political groups and dissident groups have been spied upon and infiltrated using the authorities of the PATRIOT Act. All kinds of ways that you could never anticipate and can't control are how these powers will ultimately spiral. That's just the nature of government power if you vest it, especially without serious checks and controls and constraints. It will always expand vastly beyond its original application. So even if you're comfortable with to whom it's being applied in the first instance, you should be afraid of how eventually it will apply to you. It's sort of like a rising tide that is an ocean you can sit on in the sand and be comfortable that the ocean isn't coming to where you are, but it creeps further and further in until it engulfs you. And that's the same with these abuses. The other important point is that an erosion of civil liberties destroys the opportunity to dissent. This is really an important point, and it's hard to express and describe in a clear way. But it's worth trying because I think it's so compelling. The purpose of civil liberties is to protect minority rights. Majority rights don't need protecting. in a democracy, because majorities in a democracy can do what they want. If all that we cared about was the majority being protected, we wouldn't need the Bill of Rights. No opinions that are held by the majority will ever be targeted for persecution, or religions practiced by the majority, or viewpoints espoused by them. The Bill of Rights, civil liberties at their nature, is about defending and protecting the right to dissent from prevailing orthodoxies and convention, to challenge prevailing mores, to stand up to and fight those in power. And when civil liberties are eroded, when these constraints are abolished, when we allow governments to start crossing these lines, the ability to challenge orthodoxies, which is where all progress and creativity resides, the ability to say that majorities are wrong, that conventions are in error, that the way everyone thinks things should be is wrong. The power to live in that sphere, to act in that sphere, ends up shrinking to the point of non-existence. And even if right now you're not somebody who wants to dissent because you're more or less comfortable with the way society is progressing, what mores exist and who is in dissent and who is in the majority is very fluid. It changes very rapidly. So even if you don't think that you're a dissident now and don't really care about this right today, you will tomorrow or the next month or the next year. And if you allow that sphere to be abolished because government can now crush it, we all lose something extremely valuable, even if we're not exercising it at the moment, which is this sphere where other people can engage in dissent and challenge to orthodoxies, an incredibly important attribute for any society to be preserved. I just want to underscore that point by talking for a minute about Anwar al-Awlaki, who's the American citizen that was targeted for assassination by President Obama. The real reason that the US government hated Anwar al-Awlaki was because he speaks English and is incredibly charismatic and was delivering a message to the Muslim world that the government wanted to stop. And his message was, as Muslims, we are being constantly bombarded with aggression and violence by the West and by the United States, and therefore it's the duty, not just the right, but the duty of every Muslim to fight back against the United States in order to deter this violence. Otherwise, our only option is to sit here passively and be slaughtered, as has been happening. And you can find that opinion to be extremely disturbing or troublesome. You can disagree with it vehemently all you want, but whatever else is true, that is a pure political opinion. The idea that America is the aggressor in the conflict with the Muslim world, that we're occupying their land, we're dropping bombs on them, we're sending drones over there, we are invading their countries, we're undermining their self-governance. And by targeting somebody like that, by claiming that they're a terrorist by virtue of the opinions that they express, that is a perfect illustration of how true dissent ends up being punished when we let the government cross these lines. It means that we all become afraid to wander outside of the sphere of ideas that the government has told us is permissible. And that is an extremely dangerous trait for a society to embrace, the idea that there's certain ideas that you're no longer permitted to express because you've allowed the government to punish you if you express them. The last point I want to make is probably the hardest to describe about why we should care about civil liberties erosions, but also I think the most important. And that is that when civil liberties erosions are permitted, when we allow the government to cross these lines that they're not supposed to cross, what ends up happening is a climate of fear gets created that radically changes the relationship between the citizenry and the government. In an ideal republic, the people who wield political power should fear the citizenry. They should fear the fact that if they abuse their power, there will be consequences that are unpleasant and negative for them, and that will keep them in check. But what permits that is the civil liberties protections, the idea that the people are permitted to do things like challenge their power and criticize it and attack it and stand up to it, and the government can't punish them. But when we allow the government to cross those lines, when those liberties get eroded, what happens instead is that the citizenry fears those who wield political power, and the consequences of that are extremely significant. And the way that this was really driven home to me in a very vivid way that I think really illuminates the danger is the very first time that I ever wrote about the controversy involving WikiLeaks, the organization devoted to uncovering government secrets and preventing the government from operating behind a wall of secrecy. I spent the last 2 years or so writing a lot about WikiLeaks and defending them and hailing the values that they were fulfilling in their transparency work. But the very first time I wrote about WikiLeaks was in January of 2010. And this was before almost anybody had ever heard of WikiLeaks. I hadn't heard of WikiLeaks at the time. It was before they did any of their news-making leaks, before they even posted the video of the soldiers in Baghdad shooting at unarmed civilians and killing journalists from Reuters. It was before they had really done anything in the United States. And the way that I had learned about WikiLeaks was there was a report prepared by the Pentagon that was top secret. It was designated top secret. And this report was about WikiLeaks that the Pentagon prepared, and the report described WikiLeaks as an enemy of the state. And it plotted ways to destroy WikiLeaks because they considered WikiLeaks to be such a threat. And it talked about things like fabricating documents that they would then submit to WikiLeaks in the hopes they would publish it and destroy their credibility. It talked about uncovering the identity of their sources so people wouldn't feel comfortable any longer leaking to them. A whole variety of things about how to destroy the organization that actually ended up happening and is really how WikiLeaks ended up being rendered inoperative. But in any event, this top secret report, ironically enough, was leaked to WikiLeaks, which then published it online. And there was an article in the New York Times, very brief about it, about how the Pentagon had become obsessed with this group and labeled them an enemy of the state and were plotting to destroy it. And at the time when I read that, I thought, you know, any group that has been declared an enemy of the state by the Pentagon and that the Pentagon thinks is important to destroy is probably a group that merits a lot of attention and probably a lot of support. So I went and I did a lot of research about WikiLeaks, and I found that they had done incredibly impressive acts of transparency around the world. They had exposed government deceit in Australia and East Africa. They had uncovered corporate corruption in West Africa and the Netherlands. All around the world, they were engaged in this transparency project in very impressive ways. And so I wrote a long article about the promise and potential of WikiLeaks. I interviewed Julian Assange at the time, and I published the interview in audio form with the article that I wrote. And at the end of the article, I encouraged my readers and everybody else to go and donate money to WikiLeaks because they were facing budgetary constraints that were preventing them from processing important leaks. And I posted the PayPal link to their PayPal account, and I provided the information for how money could be wired into their account. And I said, this is an important project that deserves your support. And in response to my writing that, I had huge numbers of people, I mean dozens and dozens and dozens, telling me in all kinds of ways, in the comment section to that article, by email, at events like this, people who said pretty much verbatim something along the following lines, which is, look, I agree with you completely about the promise and potential of WikiLeaks. You persuaded me that this is a group that is worthy of support. I think what they're doing is very important. But I'm actually concerned, in fact, I'm fearful, that if I donate money to WikiLeaks electronically, if I send them money via PayPal or send them a bank wire, that I'm going to end up somewhere on some government list, or even be subjected to criminal liability if they're ultimately designated a terrorist group and I'm charged with materially supporting a terrorist group. And so I just don't feel comfortable donating to them, even though I want to. And the reason that was so striking to me was because WikiLeaks was a group, there's still a group, that has never even been charged with any crime, let alone convicted of a crime. And they could never be charged with or convicted of a crime because what they're doing is pure journalism. They receive secrets from government employees that they then publish in order to shed light on what the world's most powerful factions are doing. It's pure First Amendment activity, and yet here were huge numbers of people telling me that they were voluntarily relinquishing their core First Amendment rights, which is what donating money to a political organization whose cause you support is. It's pure free speech and free association. These were citizens who were voluntarily relinquishing their own rights because they were frightened by what the government would be able to do to them. They knew that these lines that the Constitution created were meaningless because we've allowed the government to transgress them and cross them at will. And that is what erosions of civil liberties do more than anything else that directly threaten you, even if you think that they don't, even if you don't perceive the ways that they do. It changes the kinds of possibility that you recognize as a citizen. So you convince yourself that there's certain things you don't really want to do, and therefore don't realize that those things have been denied to you. The socialist activist Rosa Luxemburg once said that he who does not move does not notice their chains. He who does not move does not notice their chains. And that is a very profound insight, and really the core point here, which is that there are lots of people in the United States who convince themselves that they're really free because there's nothing they think that they would like to be doing that the government is preventing them from doing. And yet the climate of fear invades people's minds. It changes their understanding of what is possible as a citizen. It limits their view of what world they can explore and how they can engage in political activism and even the ideas that they can express. And that change is very subtle and insidious, but it's very real and very significant. And that's why I think even people who don't realize why these civil liberties erosions are acutely threatening to them, in fact, are affected by them in very direct ways. So the final point I want to make is just quickly about the political movement with which, rightly or wrongly, I'm often identified, which is the progressive faction in the United States. And what's really interesting is that if you look at the progressive political identity in the United States, it's shaped by its opposition to certain kinds of civil liberties abuses of the past 6 decades. So the progressive identity has been shaped by things like opposition to the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Even though that was done by a Democratic president, the American left was outspoken in its opposition to it. Or by opposition to the McCarthy witch hunts of the 1950s that resulted in punishment by those with political power of people who had been convicted of no wrongdoing and had done nothing other than exercise their political freedoms. Or the surveillance abuses in the 1960s of J. Edgar Hoover. And if you look at the political successes, the sort of crown jewels of the progressive legislative success, what you see are things like the Freedom of Information Act that demands that the government disclose to the citizenry what it's doing with transparency, or the War Powers Resolution that says that government's executive branch cannot prosecute wars without the consent of the American people through their Congress, or the Church Committee of the 1970s that exposed massive surveillance abuses by the government and resulted in the law called FISA, which says that the government cannot spy on our communications without first going to a court and getting a warrant. All of these achievements, all of these events were premised in the principle that the most dangerous thing we can do is vest political officials with vast power that they can exercise in the dark and without checks. That's the heart of tyranny, and nothing is more dangerous. And it's incredibly troublesome to see that same political movement, in the name of partisan loyalties, dispense with all those principles and embrace the very policies that they once claimed to so vehemently oppose. And that what that means is that if we want to think about how to challenge them, we need to make sure that we are gathering together and uniting in coalitions with our fellow citizens without regard to partisan differences or ideological differences or anything like that, because all citizens as individuals have an equal interest in defending and preserving these liberties. So with that thought, I thank you very much for listening, and I will turn it over to Bruce.
Well, following these very admirable and esteemed speakers, it's a little bit like trying to improve on the Sistine Chapel or on Beethoven's Ode to Joy. But let me try. Despite what's been said, it all has a great sense of verisimilitude to the situation in Washington. It's actually much worse. And it's much worse in part because of the complacency of the American people. Now, 2,000 years ago, as the Roman Republic degenerated into the Roman Empire, Tacitus chronicled, the worst crimes were dared by few, willed by more, tolerated by all. The Weimar Republic degenerated into the Third Reich. The worst crimes were dared by few, willed by more, tolerated by all. As the United States Republic has degenerated into an empire, the worst constitutional crimes have been dared by few, willed by more, tolerated by all. As Ecclesiastes noted, what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Now, we have heard, I think, a collective rendition of Paul Revere's Ride today. It was memorialized by William Henry Longfellow. You may have remembered it as a child. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. It was the 18th of April in '75, and barely a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. One if by land, two if by sea, and I at the opposite side shall be. And when he sounded the alarm, the Minutemen appeared, Lexington and Concord. And actually we have shrines to them. I was born in Cambridge. Now we've heard Paul Revere. Is anyone showing up at Lexington and Concord? We cannot escape moral responsibility for what our government is doing. We, the people, still are the sovereign. We are morally culpable for the things our government does. So Thomas Paine explained, a patriot saves his country from his government. So acquiescence, tacit acknowledgement without action is not morally acceptable. And we should be sobered by Dante's observation, the hottest places in hell are reserved for those in times of great moral crisis. Assume a position of neutrality, like being indecisive between the firefighter and the fire. Now I want to explain how rotten our political culture has become. And I don't use that word in any hyperbolic sense, by referring to the fundamental values that gave birth to our country, that made it the beacon for others fleeing persecution and craving liberty, that have been turned on their head, to underscore how unacceptable it is to remain acquiescent, passive in the face of impeachable offenses, war crimes committed by our government every single day. And just as a quick detour, remember that Jack Hunter told us how about mission creep. You start out with predator drones against the bad guys and it goes differently. It was only a few days after Mr. Alaki, a U.S. citizen, was vaporized that his 16-year-old son was vaporized. He became an unperson, in the words of 1984 George Orwell. Now, the Declaration of Independence, perhaps the greatest statement of the dignity of the human being, declares that we are all born with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We are born with them. We don't have to defend them. They're part of living and breathing. It's the government that must defend any encroachment on that right. And the Declaration explains that the whole purpose that governments are instituted amongst men and women is to secure liberty, not to build empires, build bureaucracies, Federal Reserves to steal from the poor, to give to the rich. The sole purpose is to preserve liberty. That's the dignity of the endeavor. That was what was so thrilling about the Declaration, what made all Europe shake and tremble, because it was an explosive dynamite towards the divine right of kings. Now, look at today. Does that principle stand at all? Of course not. It's on its head. The government is assumed to have any power it wishes to exercise. Spy on us, surveillance drones, look at all of our bank accounts, steal our electronic communications. 24 hours a day, they search every conceivable vestige of our presence in writing, electronically, working, surveillance, put it in dossiers. We have no rights except at the indulgence of the president. That is, we've been turned into literal, figurative vassals. The president has stated, we even live only at his indulgence. He can assassinate us. If he says on secret facts and secret law, we're the bad guys, whoever that is. Now, it's true there are political constraints that has caused him to desist from using predator drones and assassination in the United States at present. But they're just political constraints. We don't have any right to prevent it. It's just he's the good guy, right? So we've turned from a government of laws to a government of men. The precise thing that those sacrificing at Valley Forge, Cemetery Ridge, Omaha Beach were trying to prevent. And we have accepted that. We have accepted that because these violations of the Constitution, crimes against the rule of law, are not discoverable only by archaeological expeditions. They're in plain view. You've heard them. They're accepted. Indeed, in some sense, they're reveled in by neocons who boast, hey, this is what governments are about. Unlimited power. What good is it being president if you can't kill people from time to time? It's not worth the effort to get elected. I mean, these are things that we revolted against in 1776. Pledged lives, fortunes, and sacred honor to get rid of. It's come full circle. Come full circle. Now, if we look at the Constitution itself and to see how it's degenerated into what I call a homonym, sounds the same, means something totally different than what was envisioned when it was drafted and ratified in 1787 and then subsequently amended on 27 occasions. Now, before I get into the detail of the discrepancy between the real Constitution, the application of it today, I want to respond to what sometimes said is, well, why should we be tied to the chains of these old men 200 years ago? When the Constitution was drafted, there wasn't any internet. We couldn't go to the moon. There were not automobiles. They didn't even know about American Idol and Lady Gaga and other such blather, you know. How could they be enlightened? They didn't have fashion pages in the newspapers, worried about what the hemline was, such other drivel. So it can't be relevant today. I mean, I've seldom heard such inanity in my life. Does anyone suggest, oh, the Bible is irrelevant. It was written so long ago. Right? They didn't even have cruise ships at the time. Right? Shakespeare is irrelevant. What does he know when he was writing in 1500s and into the 1600s? Copernicus and Galileo, well, we can't trust the heliocentric system of the universe because they didn't know about fast cars and all sorts of other gadgets today, are certainly not cell phones. And why we need to sacralize, if you will, the Constitution and its precepts is because they were built on universals of human nature that will be with us forever. That combination of lust, power, avarice, domination for the sake of domination, occasionally punctuated by magnanimity and generosity, but not too frequently. Those are what were the DNA behind building the Constitution. They have never changed since 1787, and they never will change. And that's why we need to revere these principles. And we should remember that unlike today's politicians, before those who attended the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, they did vast amount of actual scholarship. James Madison went to Princeton, and he read about every single confederation in the history of the world in order to hone his mind to draft a separation of powers, concurrent authority between the federal government and the state government. That is, they treasured learning. They treasured Socrates. They did not revel in stupidity and inanity like today's candidates do running for office, thinking that they... I mean, we had a recent occupant of the White House who boasted, I don't learn by reading, just by doing. Drop a few bombs here and there and you decide what happens. It's truly staggering. Not a single member of the Congress of the United States or the White House would have been invited to attend the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Indeed, every one of them would have been evicted if they smuggled their way in, because they did not believe and understand any of those separation of powers principles. Now, it's oftentimes been said that the Bill of Rights does the yeoman service in protecting our freedoms, but I believe that's an overstatement. It's the separation of powers itself that's our greatest Bill of Rights, because it pits power against power, ambition against ambition. It doesn't entrust the indulgence that we have angels who will be ruling over us. And it's that separation of powers principles enshrined in the constitutions that have been totally and completely shredded and destroyed. All power of any significance now is entrusted to the president. We have a literal version of the divine right of kings. We have deified the president, not only in terms of the particular authorities that he exercises, but now my offices are near the White House, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. When I came to Washington 43 years ago, when the president went out for some speaking engagement at a hotel, he had about 3 or 4 policemen on motorcycles, advance guard. He had his limousine, and then there was a camera behind him. It took about 60 seconds to close off the streets. Now, it looks like a Roman emperor. If you've been to Washington and you see whoever's in the White House now go drive down Connecticut Avenue to go to a hotel, they shut down the whole street for 25 or 30 minutes. The police line the sidewalks. You can't move. You can't wiggle. You can't even smoke a cigarette. And they have hundreds of policemen. All the noise is there. For the President of the United States, I said, gee, in the Constitution, they're not even supposed to have titles of nobility. You know, this outdoes any emperor with his toga and his retinue. But let's go to the particular powers that the President now exercises. It's virtually everything. Number one, he operates in secrecy. He claims national security privilege, executive privilege, to make all these major decisions about what court cases can go forward, who gets killed, who goes to Guantanamo Bay, whose mail gets opened, whose emails get intercepted, whose phone conversations get recorded. All of that's done in secret. We don't know any of it. And think about how much that tarnishes the fundamental principle of government by the consent of the governed in the Declaration. How can you consent to something you don't even know what's happening? You can't. It's not certainly informed consent. That's a revolutionary change in our system of government. When I was first in Washington, I saw a President of the United States actually testify before the House Judiciary Committee. His name was Gerald Ford, and there was suspicion that he pardoned Nixon because it was a quid pro quo to get himself into the White House. And he testified. I worked as the counsel on the Iran-Contra Committee on Covert Arms Sales. And I was there, and we demanded and got the testimony of national security advisors, 2 or 3 of them, McFarlane and Poindexter, George Shultz, Secretary of State, Cap Weinberger, Secretary of Defense, blow-by-blow accounts of discussions of whether he was selling arms for hostages. You know, the world did not collapse, but at least it was open government. Sunshine is the best disinfectant. What do we get today? Nothing. I mean, even the social secretary, Denise Rogers, said, you can't come ask me about the party breakers who got into the White House without proper invitations because I have a security privilege. And you can guarantee everything done in secrecy degenerates into wrongdoing. That is a principle of human nature that has never been violated. Now, what else does the president claim authority to do? Again, he goes to war. He spends money without any authorization at all. This is something that even the king couldn't do in Great Britain. He could initiate war, but he had to go to Parliament to get his money. And this is precisely what the Constitution forbids. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11. Only Congress can declare war. Every single member of the founding generation agreed only Congress should authorize the country from moving from a state of peace to war. Even Alexander Hamilton, the greatest voice for a very muscular presidency, conceded that. Because all of the world was proof of the fact that countries chronically entered wars at the behest of an executive seeking to aggrandize power. It wasn't Congresses and parliaments and the people demanding wars. It was the executive concocting excuses to go to war because he gets the secrecy, the taxes, the contracts, footprints in the sands of time. I'm a transformative president. I want to be like Caesar. I came, I saw, I conquered. You know, the thrill of domination for the sake of domination, the kind of thrill that a teenager gets being a bully on a playground, stunted psychological development for those who occupy the executive branch. And I mean, it sounds funny, but the consequences are truly, horrific. We find that even today, Joe Biden was speaking to the Ohio Newspapers Publishers Association. Saying, "Oh, don't worry, America's back. We're number one, We're like we have rankings each week. Which nation is number one? And that's what we're about. Now, how many Predator drones do we use? How many people we kill? What's the GNP?" I mean, this is truly a juvenile political culture that had been shocking to the Founding Fathers. An adult culture's motivations are magnanimity, wisdom, and virtue. Those three. Magnanimity, wisdom, and virtue. That's the rank. Not number one like a football team in each weekly rankings. And now we have our leaders. What are they motivated by? So the infantile motivations of creature comforts, fame, sex, money, power for the sake of power. Things they should have grown out of when they were out of a sandbox. Saying part of that is the political culture that we accept and we inculcate. Because we don't seek to change it. We have to change it. We certainly can't believe that those moral midgets will, by spontaneous combustion, see the light. Right? That truly is a triumph of hope over experience, right? Now, we casually, I think, accept the idea of going from a state of peace to a state of war because we don't understand precisely the consequences legally of that crossing of the Rubicon. Cicero said 2,000 years ago, in times of war, the law is silent, which is surely true. You want to place the threshold high because there's unlimited executive authority. And the history of wrongdoing and abuses is legion in times of war, whether it's Abu Ghraib, the Japanese-American concentration camps in World War II, the My Lai massacre, or whatever. They're multiplied a millionfold. I'm not blaming the soldiers out there. When your life is on the line, you're not taking sober second thoughts before you shoot to kill. That's why you should be very reluctant to send people into that very precarious position. Very reluctant. And now we do it at the drop of a hat. I mean, when the president decided, you know what the president argued in Libya? We aren't at war, no hostilities. War powers resolution doesn't apply. Well, it was said, you're killing people, you're sending rockets in and bombing and destroying the country. And actually your Secretary of Defense, Mr. Gates, testified to Congress that if any country did that to us, we would incinerate them. Right? But it wasn't war in the president's mind because our pilots weren't endangered. So he ended up said, well, suppose instead of those drones and aircraft we used, we just launched ICBM missiles with nuclear warheads and blew up every living thing in Libya. Then it's not war, is it? We didn't have any of our soldiers endangered. Well, now that is really, that's post-Orwellian, right? You can destroy the world and not go to war. Right. This is, I don't even have words to describe my disgust. I came to Washington 43 years ago in the middle of Watergate. I participated in the effort to get Mr. Nixon impeached, even in the Justice Department. And the thrilling moments of that time were threefold. One, actually people quit when they were asked to do unconstitutional things then, as opposed to today. It's quaint practice, as Alberto Gonzales might say. He certainly didn't quit on authorizing the president to do all sorts of illegal things. When President Nixon fired Elliot Richardson, then Attorney General, then Bill Ruckelshaus resigned because they wouldn't get rid of Archibald Cox, who was insisting on a right and a duty to investigate the criminality of the Watergate cover-up by the President of the United States. The American people sent 2 million telegrams into the White House within 24 hours. 2 million telegrams, not emails. Telegrams were much more difficult to actually send in those days. I'm sure to you all it probably seems like living in the Pleistocene age without internet, but that in fact was the case. And the president backed down. He was going to disobey a court ruling. And then when there are the Watergate hearings, and actually members of Congress said, no, Mr. President, the Fourth Amendment doesn't enable you to burglarize Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's home just because you believe you'd like to do that. That's a crime. Even the poorest man in his hovel has a threshold that even the king cannot cross. And it meant something. And then ultimately, the highest point of my entire career is seeing that helicopter take the most powerful man in the world away from the Oval Office because the rule of law was king. The king was not law. That's what happened 43 years ago. Now I look around today. I mean, the presidential crimes against the Constitution are far greater. If we can just recite that have already been recounted. Illegally going to war, assassinating American citizens without accusation or charge, detaining individuals, persons without accusation or charge, committing crimes against the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, flouting the Fourth Amendment every day, gathering dossiers on us. Nothing happens. I've drafted articles of impeachment against both Bush, Cheney, and Obama. They didn't have to change very much, a comma here or there. Because they all are fueled by the same psychology of empire, which is quite frightening. It's frightening and juvenile at the same time. So what can be done? Well, certainly, if we understand our Constitution, we know the incumbent, and I'm sure his successor, unless the incumbent is rebuked. Impeachable offenses have occurred. Now, at the time of Nixon, people were writing in and demanding impeachment. I mean, the popular citizenry was outraged. And instead of watching anything that might resemble American Idol or the Super Bowl, they were riveted on the Watergate hearings, actually paid attention and cared about liberty at the time. Even though our enemy then, so to speak, was the Soviet Union and had 1 million times more nuclear weapons than Al-Qaeda or Iran will ever have. And we still undertook the impeachment endeavor and inquiry. Still did it. The Founding Fathers defined an impeachable offense, Article 2, Section 4, as an attempt to subvert the Constitution of the United States. So this is not an quibble about whether what the President has done justifies House impeachment and a trial in the Senate. It's a matter of political will. And it's up to this audience here to insist that members of Congress do something. They can pick up my article of impeachment, draft something different. They can start with a template that was used against Richard Nixon, or otherwise. And that's what your task is today. Now, the other task that I put before you, again, is a test of your mettle, and ours too. I'm not trying to suggest you're the only one saddled with this responsibility. We all are. We all hang together, we all hang separately, right? That was true in 1776, still true today. We want to repeal that odious piece of legislation called the National Defense Authorization Act. I've likened it to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. In its defilement of due process of law. In the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, the accused individual who is said to be a slave, no right to testify, no right to due process. The slave owner just came and told the federal marshal, oh, that slave belongs to me. That's good enough. No trial. And of course, the magistrate was paid $10 if he found the individual was a slave, and $5 if he voted in favor of freedom. So you don't have to speculate as to what the virtual unanimous verdicts were when there was contested issues of slavery. But that's what the National Defense Authorization Act most resembles. And if you want more fuel that should increase your anger about the act, contemplate the following. There was not a single citizen of the United States, or even in other countries, who was demanding that the Congress give more power to an already bloated president. Nobody was demanding it. Nobody was marching in the streets for it. Second, there was not a single congressional hearing on the act. None. Third, there was not a single finding by Congress that the already enormous arsenal that the president wielded was insufficient to protect us from the al-Qaeda menace. No findings. Congress enacts it anyway. What's going on? You need to write in once, twice, 3 times a day, maybe 5 times, to your member of Congress in the Senate. Tell them if they don't introduce a bill to repeal that act, you're going to campaign against them 24 hours a day. They must get rid of that monstrosity that has reduced us all to vassals and serfs in the eyes of the law, and we will not accept it. And I can guarantee you, if this succeeds, it will send a message on other issues that if Congress does not respond to popular will, they will pay a political price and they will fall into line. That's why this effort is so critical. It's so critical. And the system still can work. Remember the first TARP bailout vote in the House of Representatives failed. And I was in Congress that day. And it failed because there are thousands of phone calls, emails, faxes that came in from constituents saying, do not give money to these buccaneer banks over my dead body to penalize the industrious. And it didn't happen that day. But then when the public pressure diminished, it passed. So we still have that authority. We're not quite stripped with our powers to exercise sovereign will. But if it's not exercised, I can guarantee you it will atrophy. And I want to return to my theme. We are morally accountable for our government. We can't just point fingers in Washington and say, well, gee, we have real wretches that occupy positions of power. Because the Founding Fathers acted on the assumption that it would be wretches, not George Washington, who would most frequently come to Washington, D.C. That's what they built the system to accommodate. But it only works if we, the people, make those members pay a price for the irresponsibility, for dishonoring their oath of office every single day, namely to uphold and defend the Constitution when they trample on it every single day. They trample on it every single day. And I say it's only a concession to the shortness of life that we couldn't continue on to get into the other violations, whether it's the appointments power, whether it's the executive agreements that substitute for treaties, a whole litany of spending that's illegal because it hasn't been appropriated by Congress, the entire Federal Reserve System. One day they wake up and say, we want to create $600 billion to go buy foreign bonds. No accountability. These total rejections of the idea that power is in the people of the United States, not in some platonic guardians who in a very snotty way want to tell us how to run our lives. They can't even run their own lives, not to say telling other people how they ought to prosper and fulfill their own goals and designs. So you may ask yourselves, why should I do this? Because the battle seems so incredibly daunting. It's recounted, the mass media doesn't discuss any of these issues that we have broached this evening. It's like these are trivial matters. What really matters is the fashion shows and whether X, Y, and Z is going to win Dancing of the Stars or the other drivel that teenagers fret about. So we don't have an easy task. It's like flying into a headwind of 120 miles an hour. But that doesn't mean we aren't obliged to undertake the effort. Even mounting Mount Everest begins with a single step. And it's simply true that in the history of progress, all great ideas and movements have begun when it seemed hopeless. But there are those brave men and women with the courage to try anyway. And they left there an implant of an idea, of a role model that inspired future generations when the time was more propitious. I was born in Cambridge near Boston, where William Garrison first began the Liberator magazine in 1831, and he pronounced slavery was a covenant with hell. And he encountered all the withering criticism. Oh, Mr. Garrison, the politics is against you, the money is against you, this is just a foolhardy exercise. But he stayed with it, even though he was tarred and feathered his first year. And he was there in 1865, 13th Amendment was ratified, eliminating slavery, and that day was the last issue of the Liberator. Even though there were many times during that interim when he was in despair. And many of you women in the audience probably remember 1848, Seneca Falls. Women said, gee, we really ought to have the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, many of those heroes were dead before the 19th Amendment was ratified. They said no subjugation of women was wrong. And there are undoubtedly thousands of people in the history of mankind who stood up for something that was right at the time. They've been killed. We don't even know who they are. But at least they planted the idea. They challenged injustice and enabled us right now to inherit its benefits. That's why we can be in this room and speak and think freely, because those who came before us were worried about those yet to be born. They were willing to take sacrifices and make them so that their posterity did not inherit the tyranny that would extinguish free minds at the outset. And that's the task that we have to undertake. I'm not going to suggest that we can necessarily win it, even in our lifetimes, because this rot in our political culture has begun over a century ago. It's moved from adagio to allegro after the Soviet Union disintegrated in 9/11, because there's no restraint on our arrogance. You know, it's epitomized by American exceptionalism. We have different DNA. Our genes are different than anybody else. We aren't tempted by the same vices that other human species are. A total and complete arrogance that causes other people to be exceptionally resentful. But that's our task, and I think I can promise you that you will find the challenge itself, the undertaking itself, is its own reward, even if it seems to fail in this lifetime. Because there is nothing more exhilarating as a human being than the search and the action on truth without ulterior motives. Thank you.
Now we're going to begin to take some questions from the audience. And do we have a microphone set up here? There we go. We got one here, and do I see one hiding over there? We're doing both sides. So anyone who has a question, please step up to the microphone and we'll get rolling with those. Or did Bruce just basically settle everything for everybody tonight? I mean. Yes, sir.
Good evening, gentlemen. I have a question regarding habeas corpus in the post-9/11 era. Article 1, Section 9 of the U.S. Constitution states that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. Now, to me, it seems that the National Defense Authorization Act takes away the right of habeas corpus in a very profound way without invasion or rebellion. So I'm curious as to what you gentlemen see will be the invasion or rebellion justification for the removal of the writ of habeas corpus.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to take a look at that. You know, it's interesting that there's so many abuses that happen so continuously that you forget them from one year to the next. Before there was the National Defense Authorization Act, there was this equally heinous piece of legislation called the Military Commissions Act that was passed in October of 2006. It was, at the time, it looked like the Republicans were invariably going to lose the midterm elections. And Karl Rove's strategy was to make the Democrats vote on civil liberties bills so that when some of them voted no, he could run and claim that they wanted all your children to die at the hands of the terrorists. And a few Democrats did vote against it. Most voted for it, but he ran those ads anyway, and they didn't work. But what that bill said was that the president had the right to imprison people at Guantanamo without even allowing them habeas corpus. Habeas corpus basically means that if you're imprisoned by the government, you have at least one chance to ask the court to release you on the grounds that there's no evidence to justify your incarceration. It's a much lower right than being charged with a crime and having the government have to prove your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It's the most minimal procedural guarantee that prisoners can have. And the Congress in 2006 actually abolished habeas corpus for Guantanamo detainees. They said that people could be held without even this right. And I remember it was an incredible debate, and if you Google this online, you can actually find the video. It's incredibly entertaining, as dark and horrible as it is. Arlen Specter, who sort of made a career out of making really pretty speeches and then turn around and violating everything that he said, stood up on the floor during the debate of the Military Commissions Act, and he said, "This bill will send us back 900 years because this is returning us to the age before the Magna Carta, because the Magna Carta was designed really to say that the king couldn't imprison you without giving you a chance to prove your innocence." And after he said that this bill will reverse 900 years of Western justice, about 20 minutes later they did the roll call for the bill, and they said Senator Specter, and he stood up and said aye, and he voted for the bill. But that bill passed with bipartisan support, and then in the Supreme Court in 2008, one of the very few times the Supreme Court has actually stood up to the executive branch in the post-9/11 era. Courts have been pretty disgracefully subservient, but this is one exception. They said that every person under the control of the U.S. government in a U.S. jurisdiction, which they said Guantanamo was, at least has the right to habeas corpus. So even though the government doesn't have to charge you with a crime, it doesn't have to prove your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, it does have to at least give you one opportunity to get into a court and tell the court that the government should have to show some evidence. And what happened after that case, the Boumediene case in 2008, was for the first time Guantanamo detainees, and by this point the government assured us the only ones left there are the worst of the worst. These are the hardcore terrorists who will do the most heinous things to your children if we ever let them out. One by one, they were allowed to finally get into a federal court because of the Supreme Court case that was done by a 5-4 ruling, and contest the government's claims against them and to force the government to show evidence. And 75% of the Guantanamo detainees still in Guantanamo as of 2008, many, many years in those cages without any due process, 75% of them won their cases in federal court. Federal court said there is no credible evidence to justify the accusations that these are terrorists and that these need to be imprisoned, which means our government was not just holding people for many years without any charges or due process. They were holding people who were completely innocent, guilty of nothing. Not just the ones who were rounded up in the first instance and released a couple years later, but still there as of 2008, 2009. So there is this minimal habeas corpus right that you have even now because of the Supreme Court decision, but it's far, far short of what you're supposed to have, which is the right to be charged with a crime and have a jury of your peers decide that you're guilty beyond a reasonable doubt before you can be imprisoned.
I think I have an anecdote that can even exceed yours, Glenn, about Senator Arlen Specter, because I testified against the Military Commissions Act before Arlen Specter's committee, and adjacent to me, just like Glenn here, was then Dean of the Yale Law School named Harold Coe. Mr. Coe was as vehement as I was in denouncing the act as a total injustice to those who might be falsely accused, especially since we were giving $1-million bounties to any Afghan who would find an al-Qaeda in their midst and promise them lifetime of leisure on the Riviera. And Mr. Coe, however, later became the legal advisor at the State Department, who's now turned entirely the other direction. He's defending every suspension of every right ever conceived by the Founding Fathers without blushing. So, yes, we see that there's one principle at work in Washington, D.C. It's the principle of self-aggrandizement. Now, with regard to, again, this surreal effort to suspend habeas corpus, what the government argued in the case was that these combatant status review tribunals were a sufficient safeguard against injustice compared to independent judiciary. Now, a combatant status review tribunal consisted of the military itself would decide whether it captured someone incorrectly. You didn't have a right under a combatant status review tribunal to understand any of the charges against you. And a typical hearing, you can read some of the transcripts, they're quite humorous, as though you're reading Alice in Wonderland Taliban and perhaps the trial of the knave accused of stealing the tart. The detainee comes in, and the CSRT says, well, are you innocent? Prove me you're innocent. And the response would be, well, what are you accusing me of? Say, well, that's up to you to decide. No, don't burden us with that. Because the rules said the government had a rebuttable presumption that everyone they detained was there properly. It's truly something that Franz Kafka would be challenged to exceed in writing his novels. Now, with regard to the actual habeas corpus that exists, the Supreme Court made clear that it applied to Guantanamo because we had de facto sovereignty over Guantanamo Bay. Even though it was a leasehold interest. And we had the government of the United States saying, no, actually, we don't exercise any territorial control over Guantanamo Bay. We just have a leasehold interest, just like a landlord could kick us out. I said, oh, well, even Fidel Castro can't even walk in there. What do you mean you don't have complete control over it? Indeed, if Mr. Castro entered, you'd probably capture him or kill him. But the courts have said that as long as you take a Guantanamo detainee and ship them to Bagram prison in Afghanistan, then you can escape even the limited habeas corpus right. And to underscore how limited it is, the detainee still doesn't get to see the evidence that's so-called submitted to show he's an enemy combatant. It's submitted ex parte, and the judge gets to look at it and make the decision. But the accused does not actually know what it is that's being said to incline the government to conclude he's associated with the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or something like that, and to show how incredibly dangerous that power is to operate secretly. See, this is 10 years after 9/11. There is no accepted definition of what the earmarks of Al-Qaeda or Taliban are. You know, they don't wear numbers, they don't have membership cards, they don't have dues or things like that. So how do you decide whether someone's Al-Qaeda or not? They still have no idea. That's why when you read in the newspapers, well, Predator drones, 11 militants killed and 3 collateral damaged civilians. How do they come up with that number 11? They don't do postmortems to go search the clothes and say, I see. Said membership card, joined Al-Qaeda in December blank so-and-so. Yeah. That's why you see how quickly we keep killing number 2 in Al-Qaeda. It's the most dangerous job on the planet. Everyone who gets there, we keep killing the number 2 over and over again, which shows that the elusiveness of the standard makes the habeas right much weaker than it ought to be. And then lastly, we have a even further encroachment on rights where the government itself, when the court issues an opinion in the habeas corpus, the government redacts all the stuff that they say is classified information. You can read a case called against Latif. He's an Algerian, I believe, he's accused of being an enemy combatant. 99% of the case is redacted. You trying to understand the laws, and it's worse than Caligula, putting them very high on the wall so he could snare you into a violation. You have no idea what the case is about. All you do is know the case caption and 1 or 2 adjectives about, what he had for lunch. That's the end of it. And the government now is telling the judiciary what they can print in an opinion. Can you imagine reading a Supreme Court case and it all is blank sheets? In my own experience, it's even gone to a more incredible extent. I am involved in a suit against the president of Sri Lanka for extrajudicial killings under the Torture Victims Protection Act. And the government submitted a suggestion of immunity. Harold Coe, our good friend Harold Coe, that said to the judge, we are telling you, you must dismiss this case because it will interfere with the president's foreign policy. You can't even permit Mr. Fein to respond to that. Indeed, your only authority, once we tell you to dismiss the case, is to do what we told you to do. Now they've not only usurped the legislative power, but now the judicial power. And I say this is the arrogance that the Founding Fathers knew would take root unless there is resistance. And the resistance has to be us.
Chairs, if you'll fill, okay, there we go. If you will fill those yellow cards out, we have books up here by the panelists that they'll be glad to sign for you that we will raffle off before we end the evening. But let's go ahead into the question over here. Yes, sir?
My question's for all three of the panelists, but more towards Mr. Fein, or maybe even Mr. Hunter if he wants to answer this. I once heard a radio talk show host refer to the Second Amendment as the doomsday provision. He was talking about, like, if all of our other amendments or Bill of Rights had failed, the Second Amendment was still there for us to take back our country. This kind of gets me into the area of what one of our panelists was talking about earlier, where you kind of don't really want to talk about it because you know that there might be negative consequences. But when do you guys feel it is right to take back our government by violent or militant terms?
Liddy? Was the talk host G. Gordon Liddy?
No, it was some guy out of Texas, actually.
Well, that brings to mind, Bruce, and I'll let you answer the question. Just, you know, the Jefferson and the eternal vigilance and whatnot. But go ahead, Bruce.
Well, listen, the Founding Fathers understood that. And I'm not saying, you know, the line isn't as clear as Euclidean geometry, but what they write in the Declaration of Independence is that when a government becomes destructive of the rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and it, by its actions, evinces a design to reduce the people to vassalage, there's not only a right, there's a duty to revolt. Not a right, a duty. Now, have we reached that line yet? In my judgment, probably not, because I've seen the system does have enough freedom to enable us, through political means, to rebuke and the excesses and to recapture the government. Can there be a time when this government is so degenerate that it justifies rebellion? Yes, I say I don't think we're there yet. But at that time, it won't be a rule of law issue. At that time, you know, you're throwing down the stakes like our founding fathers. You lose that war, you're going to be convicted of treason. George Washington knew that was going to happen to him if the surrender at Yorktown was the other way around. It's something that the founding fathers said should not be done lightly, because in times of warfare, typically the demagogues and the worst rise to the top, but not invariably the case. And that's all the more reason why we have a duty to act before it's too late, before the only remedy is picking up the gun to recapture the government to where it ought to be.
There's a great legal opinion where Alex Kosinski, United Circuit Judge, makes reference to this doomsday weapon. And the style of the case is Lockyer versus Silvera, and I highly recommend you to Google it and read it. It's absolutely fantastic. And Kosinski talks in there. He says, look, in the worst case scenario, where there's a coup, a military coup, and the officials take over, or they're not standing for re-election, and tyranny is spreading across the land, that a disarmed citizenry, that's a mistake you can only make once. I mean, you can never make it again because you don't have the means to resist. We see this going on in the Middle East, where people, you know, they lack the means to overthrow a tyrannical regime. So I'd highly recommend you taking a look at that opinion. It's absolutely fantastic.
Let's take the next question over here.
All right. Well, granted, I'm not as good of a speaker as you guys, but when I bring up issues like this with my friends, they either think I'm crazy or that or they just don't care. So how would you say that I can motivate people to believe that these issues are one of the most important things facing us today?
You know, it's interesting. That question, some variant of that question, is asked all the time at events like this, and I think it's important that it is, because I think what happens is if you come to an event like this and you hear a bunch of speakers offering these systemic critiques of the political culture and talking about all the things that are wrong, it's very easy for this kind of gloominess to set in. You know, oh my God, I just listened to these people talk about all these horrible things that are wrong. I think I'm ready to go jump off a bridge somewhere. You know, it's easy to breed defeatism if you don't also talk about ways that you can battle against these things effectively. But the interesting question, the interesting thing about that question, you know, what is it that we can do at places when posed at places like this, is that gathering at places like this is doing something. When you go and talk to your friends, the change may not be immediate. You may not be instantly successful, but you planted ideas in their head. You've perfected the ways that you have to persuade other people. You know, one of the things that I always found so encouraging about the Occupy Wall Street movement was that it sort of began with these kind of people who were kind of professional political agitators, but then it became a social scene, and it became something that attracted a lot of people who had never been to those before. And in that social scene, it became lots of younger people talking to one another, exchanging ideas, educating each other, and it just became very organic that way. And it raised consciousness in lots of ways that was very effective. The same thing has happened with the Ron Paul movement and the movement around it. It's attracted more and more people. It's so much more intense and potent this election cycle than it was the last, because it's gained so many adherents through the power of its message. So a lot of times I think it's easy to overlook the power of ideas, but it's extremely potent. And every time you come to a place like this, every time you go online, every time you write an op-ed or a letter to the editor to your local newspaper or post something on Facebook, you can use the power of the internet to reach huge numbers of people that were previously unreachable unless you work for some large media corporation. All of these opportunities exist for us to disseminate ideas in effective ways, and it's a slow, grinding process. The progress is often imperceptible, but you can find lots of pieces of evidence that it actually is working. And in that effort, though the success may not be immediate, you are actually making progress.
But I think insofar as you want to shame your colleague into action, just tell him. If his ancestors had that attitude, he'd inherit a condition of vassalage or serfdom. And doesn't it repugnant that he would not seek to preserve for those yet to be born the same freedoms that he inherited? That's simply not an acceptable thing that civilized people do. Now, you could say maybe he's indifferent to that. And he's unmovable. I agree. At that point, you'd move on to somebody else who's capable of some kind of shame. Yeah.
Gentleman over here.
Yeah, hi. This question is more towards Mr. Greenwald in particular. What are your opinions on the recent activities of the internet hacktivist group Anonymous, specifically its role in the takedown of several government websites, be it local, state, or federal?
Huge fan of Anonymous, to be honest. I harbor lots of admiration for them, and the reason is that there's a lot of factions and entities that think that they are beyond any consequence or repercussion. And they're largely right about that. They are beyond consequence or repercussion. So, part of my defense of WikiLeaks, I would always encounter the view, well, if you have this kind of indiscriminate exposure of government secrets, there may be harm that accrues. You may have unpredictable results. And that was true. But since there's no other effective means of bringing transparency to those in power, the fact that WikiLeaks alone was doing it made me automatically side with them. And that's how I feel about Anonymous as well. So if large corporations do things like cut off funding because the government doesn't like their political activities, I like the fact that Anonymous will try and sabotage their websites. If there are tyrants in the world and dictators in the world who are hiding incriminating secrets, I like the fact that Anonymous will go and hack into their email accounts and publish their secrets to the world. What it's saying to the world's most powerful factions is you're actually not invulnerable. There actually is a price to pay. And even though they're not doing anything cataclysmic, I mean, there's sort of primitive attacks, they're denial of service attacks, things that can be repaired pretty quickly. It's providing the template for how fighting back can be accomplished. And it's inspiring other people as well to say that these powerful factions that want you to think they're intimidating and vulnerable can actually be stood up to. So is it the perfect means of achieving these ends? No, but as far as I can tell, it's better than other things. And if there are people who are gathering together and in any sort of effective way undermining and subverting corrupt power, I'm going to be an advocate for them.
I just make a general observation that I think is critical in thinking about where resources and worries ought to be focused, and that is whatever private individuals or organizations can do in creating mischief, it's a fraction of what the government can do. And that's why the Founding Fathers always, it wasn't because they had this Pollyannish belief that human nature was perfect, far be it. They knew individuals could do terrible things too. They would understand Timothy McVeigh's or even Osama bin Laden's. But as bad as they are, individuals have committed a tiny, minuscule proportion of all the evil in the history of mankind. Governments are responsible for 99% of that.
Okay, let's take a question over here.
Good evening, gentlemen. The other night I read a quote stating that the superior man understands what is right, while the inferior man understands what will sell. to me, this epitomizes basically every politician or most, running for office these days. And a lot of voters really basically take after this view, going basically after convenience instead of principle. How would any of you argue against this notion of complacency and basically urge people to stand for what is right and principled instead of what is merely convenient?
Well, I mean, you put your finger on an interesting thing, which is, if you're a politician, it sort of makes sense. It's almost rational to say, I don't want to defend this particular position even though it's right, because doing so won't keep me in power. Maybe it'll even undermine my ability to stay in power. That's human nature. You expect that kind of decadent rationale from politicians. But what is really disturbing is the fact that, as you say, is that lots of citizens have not only accepted that view but adopted it. It's almost like if you listen to citizens talk about politicians, they almost adopt a role as though they're their political advisors or their consultants. So they'll say, yeah, I disagree with what Barack Obama is doing or Mitch McConnell is doing or whomever, but I understand that they're doing it because it's politically expedient and they need to do it in order to win the election. And that's the kind of mindset that basically becomes enablers of political corruption. And again, one of the things that I find so inspiring about the Ron Paul candidacy is that he's really one of the only political figures. I mean, you've seen others. I think Dennis Kucinich is like this, but he hasn't achieved the success. Who's willing to go into audiences and express ideas that he knows those audiences don't agree with and even might find offensive, and believes that just through sheer passion and commitment to the principle, he'll be able to persuade them. And I think that one of the reasons why I find that candidacy so inspiring is because it has taught people to expect from politicians that they ought to follow their principle and their belief in what is right, even if it's not what people would suggest is politically expedient, and to reject those politicians who do the opposite. So I think he's provided an example, a counterexample, one of the very rare ones, for how people's expectations of their politicians can shift in that regard.
I think another thing to keep in mind on methodology is focus on yourself. I mean, I think this is one of the grandest, most glorious movements in history. I mean, I absolutely love it. I think we can achieve it in the short term. You never know about the power of ideas. But even if we don't, if I go to my grave, I mean, just the idea of having participated in this is so fantastic. But you have to concentrate on yourself, on our own movement here, that you be the superior person. You maintain your integrity. You maintain your ideals. Even if everyone around you isn't, then you attract people to you. I mean, that's what changes mankind is. That's how one person changes. You maintain the purity of your principles and your commitment to your ideals. I don't care how old you get. When you're young, that's your time of being idealistic. But don't lose it, and maintain your integrity. That's how we're going to change the world.
You see, I also think that what's needed is, I tried to create a school called a National Leadership Institute. Right now, we have what I call an acephalous political culture, or the human weather vane political culture, where everything's got a shelf life of 5 seconds until a new idea becomes more politically expedient. But we need to train people in the arts of leadership. It's not just knowing what's wrong, but how you build something constructively to replace something that's deficient. And that's what I call, we have a subliterate society, a sub-educational educational system. And we need to actually teach people philosophy and values are more important building blocks of wisdom than going on the internet and retrieving things at lightning speed, but it's still blather that's being retrieved.
Okay, we've got a few more minutes here. I do want to remind everybody there is a social event afterward, the big bar VIP room, and that's across the street. I imagine some of the people in this room already know where that is. You need a wristband before you go. So we'll be heading over there afterward, and let's take a question over here.
Good evening, gentlemen. I'm from Norway, and this past summer we were rocked pretty hard by a terrorist attack. Now we are facing a crossroad where people demanding action and government is looking, what exactly should we do? How should we prevent this without going too far? So if you were put in a position to advise my government at the highest level, what advice would you give them in this difficult situation?
Not to yield 1 inch of civil liberties. I mean, these kinds of tragedies happen all the time, whether it's at Columbine, and every nation encounters them. And the problem is we inflate the danger and the risk a millionfold by fright and fear that the government has. And part of it is this refusal to accept the idea that we can't have a risk-free existence. Oxygen, I mean, risk is part of the oxygen of freedom and liberty. If you want a risk-free existence, stick everybody in prison. And it's the price that we pay to some degree that tragedies like this can happen. So we can be free, but we would be willing to accept that risk because we'd rather be free than risk-free in serfs. So don't overreact. And don't succumb to all the, the alarms. Well, gee, we can't say anything bad about Islam because this encourages people then to take off or whatever. Listen, anybody who's ever written or read, Shakespeare or Edgar Allan Poe probably implanted in the mind of some demented individual some nefarious criminal design. We don't then stop reading or producing Shakespeare or Edgar Allan Poe novels or things of that sort. But it's characteristic that after any kind of cataclysm like that, the government dramatically overreacts. You need to sit back, take sober second thoughts. It'll go away. It's a tragedy that should be remembered, and all those who perish, we need to have a moment of silence because that's not anything that everyone, desires to risk. I mean, not to applaud in any respect. But in the United States, that's exactly what we didn't do after 9/11. We turned the country into a literal prison.
All right, let's take a question over here.
My question is primarily for Mr. Greenwald. I'm a senior studying journalism at Ohio University down in Athens, and I just want to get your opinion on the current state of journalism, who you think is out there doing great journalism right now, and how it can be improved.
Yeah, so who's doing great journalism? That'll be a really short answer. Yeah, exactly, WikiLeaks. One of the things we're talking about here is different checks that were supposed to exist on abuse of power. And it is true, as Bruce has emphasized, that the ultimate check is supposed to be us, the citizenry. But another important check was supposed to be the media, the class of journalists, the fourth estate, that was supposed to serve as an adversarial check on power. And what has happened is the exact opposite. And there's lots of reasons why, but essentially journalists have stopped being this insurgent outsider force to political power and have become instead integrated into it. So that, if you look at sort of the iconic journalists from 50 years ago, it was sort of a person who knew they were going into a profession where they were likely to be pretty poor. It was somebody who had an outsider mentality who wanted to challenge and subvert political power instead of serving it and amplifying it and helping to entrench it. The kind of iconic journalist was some, slovenly person sitting late night in a newsroom with print all over their hands. Very much kind of an outsider to everything that was the elite factions. And what has happened instead is that journalists have become the exact opposite of that. They're largely very rich now. They work for the largest corporations and are among the highest paid employees of those corporations. Socioeconomically, they identify far more with those in power than they do with people outside of power, and they advance in their career not by challenging those in power, not by earning their enmity or acrimony, but instead by accommodating them as much as possible. And so what we have instead is a media class that no longer sheds light on those in power or undermines it, but instead serves it and amplifies it and reinforces their message. It's just embedded into what these media corporations have become, and it's reversed what journalism was supposed to be about, which was a check on power. It's now just an arm of power. And the reason why that doesn't really matter or isn't a cause for despair is because technology, specifically the internet, has made it increasingly easy to circumvent those media institutions so that you no longer need, as I said earlier, to go and work for some huge media conglomerate and submit to all the constraints that entails. If you want to communicate with your fellow citizens or report on what the government is doing, you can go on the internet and start a blog in about 6 seconds. And if you contribute something unique and valuable and find a way to get people to listen to you, you can develop a huge audience in a very short period of time. It enables citizens to communicate with one another without the mediation of those corporate entities. I know, like at the start of our tour, I spoke with the president of the Young Americans for Liberty at Columbia University, where we went first, and he said to me, I asked him when the organization began, and I was actually pretty shocked to learn. He told me it began only in 2008 as an outgrowth of the Ron Paul campaign. And the reason I was shocked by that was because this is an organization, the Young Americans for Liberty, that's everywhere. I mean, you go on the internet and it's just like moss growing out of the walls. And the fact that it grew so quickly and so substantially in so many places is a testament to what technology does. It let people who are like-minded be able to find one another and connect with one another without the necessity of relying on these institutions. And that is a huge change, so that you no longer need to think about how to change and improve these establishment journalistic institutions. You can just create your own entity that competes with them and that supplants them and that does the things they're failing to do. So there is some good journalism even at the biggest newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post. That's why we know about CIA black sites and the Bush administration's illegal spying program, Abu Ghraib. These are newspaper outlets that published it and made us aware of it. But by and large, what they do is disseminate government propaganda rather than expose it. And so it's up to us to use the technologies that are available to us to find a way to correct that. And I think you see that in all different ways. And it's one of the real causes for enthusiasm, I think.
I just want to augment Glenn's thorough response. I think it matters at least in one respect, and that is the media conglomerates have enough resources to do a thorough investigation of the Pentagon, to uncover scandals and wrongdoing that an individual doesn't, even if he's got access to the internet and the blog. It's what Alexander Michaeljohn said: if the First Amendment is to do its work, it's not necessary that everyone shall speak, but that everything worth saying shall be said. And you need a certain amount of resources in order to penetrate with intensity the vast Byzantine bureaucratic complex in Washington. Moreover, the urgency of the media playing that checking role has grown logarithmically as Congress has turned into what I call the invertebrate branch. It does nothing. It does not want to do anything. It does not want to vote on anything. It's now accepted the idea that it has no oversight authority. The Senate Intelligence Committees are a joke. The administration tells whatever it wants to and keeps secret whatever it wants to. So that means the media has to step in and perform what's the equivalent of the oversight role of the executive branch. And one of the things in my lifetime that's been so dismaying is to see the revolving door. It used to be said in the Pentagon there was a revolving door. You went in the military, you served for a while, you went out and worked for Boeing and Lockheed or Northrop Grumman and then sold weapons to the military. But now that happens in the media. You'll see people who are working in newspapers and broadcast. They'll go in and serve as the press secretary to the Secretary of State or the President, and then they go back out, and then they make millions of dollars. And it does corrupt them. You should read a book called by Robert Novak, the late famous journalist, op-ed writer, and he, the Prince of Darkness, and which he says, no media reporter worth anything criticizes his sources because his sources will dry up. Well, that's the end of a checking role when you can't criticize your sources. That's why he wouldn't disclose who was it who told him that Valerie Plame was a CIA agent.
All right, I apologize to everyone. We're running way over on time. We're going to take one more question, and I've got the raffle things here, and we'll shuffle them up a little bit. If you still need to get yours in, hand them to that gentleman right there. We will give away the books and wrap this up. So, sir, you have the last question of the evening.
All right. It seems to me that the mentality of the national security state and those who favor empire-type foreign policy is that the more people are free, the more we have to fear. And I think that's what led to the PATRIOT Act, the NDAA bill, and other things that take away our civil liberties. So can you just, elaborate on the quote that Ben Franklin gave, that those who give up liberties for security will get neither? Because I feel like that's something that can be well understood by people like us who may, read books or go to seminars like this. But when you're trying to just break it down and make it simple for the average person who, may have a full-time job or a full-time family, what kind of argument, can you really make to them that kind of makes it plain that, things that, our government is doing today will lead to a worse future tomorrow?
Yeah, what's interesting is I actually had a debate about this today because there was a poll yesterday that came out that it wasn't all that surprising, but seeing it quantified was pretty amazing nonetheless. It said that something like 80% of Americans now favor the continuation of Guantanamo remaining open. And not only 80% of Americans, but something like 70% of Democrats and 60% of liberal Democrats favor the continuation of Guantanamo, even though closing Guantanamo was, the central plank in President Obama's campaign. And it also said that the similar percentages support the use of drones to kill accused terrorists, including American citizens, even though they slaughter Muslim children and innocent women and men by the hundreds. And there were a lot of progressives. I wrote a column about that yesterday because I was kind of amazed that the percentages have changed so rapidly just because there's a Democrat in office. And I wrote it under the very subtle and understated headline, repulsive progressive hypocrisy, because that's what it was to me. And I had a debate over the last 24 hours. Progressives said, well, look, you're imposing unrealistic expectations on President Obama because it's not his fault. It's just that Americans don't really value these civil liberties. They don't really care about them. Which it was odd to me because it meant that he made a major miscalculation when he made those issues the centerpiece of his presidential campaign and vowed to reverse them, a kind of weird thing to do if nobody cared about them. But so you're right, it is a challenge to get people to understand why these things matter, and it may not be an easy task. I mean, that's why, in what I talked about ways to get people to see how it's immediately threatening. But one of the things that's interesting is people realize it retrospectively. So, most Americans understand that, for example, the internment of Japanese Americans in concentration camps during World War II was a national disgrace, or that the McCarthy witch hunts were an act of wrongdoing, or that J. Edgar Hoover was out of control at the FBI, and he did things like spied on the conversations of Martin Luther King in order to learn things about him, to blackmail him, and even sent him a letter at one point saying, if you need to go commit suicide or stop what you're doing or we're going to expose these things about you. So getting people to see that these abuses have taken place in very pernicious ways, not a little bit, not in certain cases, but continuously, regardless of whether there's a Republican or Democrat in office, I think is the most important thing to underscoring how serious these dangers are. It's a way of getting them to see that it isn't just likely, but it's inevitable that if you invest this power in political leaders and let them exercise it, that they're going to abuse it in ways that are very damaging and wrong. And rather than waiting 40 years or 60 years to learn about them and oppose them, we ought to be opposing them now. But, it may not be an easy task. There aren't necessarily bumper sticker slogans. In order to convince people, it's a more difficult task to get people to care about these issues, and that's really the challenge.
But I think you can explain that what they're doing is they're rolling dice with their own liberty and freedom. And if that's how little they care about it, I guess there's little that you can do. If someone would like to be a vassal and a serf, how can you convince someone a bovine, cow-like existence really is not exhilarating? You just got to move on to somebody else. But that's exactly what they're doing. They're rolling the dice. Because if you look at the history of all other tyrannies, it always begins with the smallest minority. Remember the Nazis. First they came for the Jews, then the trade unionists, then the Roman Catholics, then they came for me, and no one was there to defend me. It doesn't mean it's going to happen on exactly the same chronology, but I wouldn't risk liberty. It's too precious.
Yes. Yes, this has been, I think all of these are being videotaped. It's streaming on the web right now as well. So now we're going to pick a few select winners to win the books of these gentlemen that are on the panel, and I'm just picking these out of the blue, so don't get mad. Anthony Hennon. That's you? Okay. Here, this is Bruce Fein's book, American Empire Before the Fall. Now I've got Liberty, Security, and the War on Terrorism, edited by Mr. Jacob Hornberger. And that goes to, let me pick it out of the middle here. I'm not going to be able to say this last name correctly. John Kusawara? Kasawara. I wasn't even close, but...
Actually, you're a lot closer than mine.
Okay. Make me feel a little bit better. Now we have a copy of Mr. Glenn Greenwald's With Liberty and Justice for Some. And let's see. Jake Teschler. Did you just say you wanted this? Is that? All right, we've got two more left. The Failure of America's Foreign Wars, edited by Jacob Hornberger. Let me go to the bottom here. Let's see what comes up. Brian Koenig. And the last book I have is another copy of Bruce Fein's American Empire Before the Fall. I'll go to the top. And that goes to Colin Fitzpatrick. Is that Colleen? Did I say that completely wrong? Is that you? Okay. And I'd like to remind everybody the social event afterward is at the Big Bar VIP room across the street. $2 Blue Moon mugs, $2 cherry and grape bombs. That sounds like a good time to me. Congratulations. And before we leave, I think Mr. Hornberger has a few choice words to say.
Yeah, on behalf of the Future of Freedom Foundation, I want to thank everyone for coming and also thank the Young Americans for Liberty. You know, the idea for this tour actually started last summer when Bruce and I were doing a panel at a conference. And he said, hey, you know, we ought to take this show on the road to college campuses. And immediately all the light bulbs went off in my head. And like literally 3 minutes later, Jeff Frazee, you know, president of Yale Nation, I mean the Nationals, Yale, he's walking by and I said, hey, Jeff, what do you think about it? And he had sat in on the panel and I said, what do you think about taking this on the road to college campus? He says, oh man, I'd love it. So we put it together and then I wanted Glenn. I mean, these two guys, I cannot tell you what a blast it's been this week going on this tour. Well, I mean, we feel like, you know, Mick Jagger maybe or something, you know. And, I mean, these two guys are my heroes. So I got Glenn in. If you don't read Glenn Greenwald's blog, you should be. I mean, this is the best blog on civil liberties anywhere. And Bruce, another one of my heroes, I mean, we search for his articles every day. At the Future of Freedom Foundation, we publish a daily email update. We consider and strive to make it the best libertarian commentary page on the internet. We link to both of these guys' articles, plus many more. I'd like to invite you to subscribe. It's free for the asking. And I know what it's like to organize something like this. And I can't tell you how nice it is for us just to come in on these campuses and have Yale already have everything set up and been run beautifully in every university we've gone to, Columbia and Middle Tennessee and Indiana and Purdue, and now wrapping things up here at Ohio State. It's been absolutely fantastic. It's been an honor to partner with Yale, and I want to thank y'all very much, and thank you for coming, and thank Ohio State University.
Appreciate y'all being here. Thank you.